Picture this: the golden sands of Egypt, the monumental pyramids piercing the sky, the silent, stoic gaze of the Sphinx. These are the images that instantly come to mind when we think of ancient Egypt. We know the pharaohs, the gods, the mummies, and the glittering treasures of gold and lapis lazuli. But what about the world of the everyday? What about the clothes they wore, the very fabrics that touched their skin and swayed with their movements? There is a whole other dimension to this ancient civilization, a vibrant, living world of color and texture that has, for the most part, completely vanished from our view. We are about to step away from the stone and the gold to explore a far more intimate and fleeting art form, the lost textile patterns of ancient Egypt. This isn't just a story about cloth. It's a window into the lives, the aesthetics, and the very soul of a people whose brilliance we are still trying to fully comprehend. Think about the last time you chose an outfit, considering the color, the pattern, the feel of the fabric. It's a deeply personal act, a form of self-expression. Now, imagine that same impulse echoing across thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians weren't just building for eternity. They were living, breathing individuals who valued beauty in their daily lives. The linens they wove, the dyes they mastered, the intricate patterns they designed, these were statements of identity, social status, and spiritual belief. But unlike the stone carvings that survived the millennia, textiles are fragile. They decay, they crumble to dust. The vast majority of these artistic creations are gone forever, their secrets lost to time. This creates one of the most tantalizing mysteries in archaeology. What did this hidden world of Egyptian fashion truly look like? And what profound stories are woven into the threads we can no longer see? This video is an invitation to become a detective of the distant past. We are going on a journey to piece together the clues, to follow the faint traces left behind. We'll explore the rare, miraculous fragments that have survived in the dry desert air, decipher the patterns depicted in tomb paintings, and understand the incredible craftsmanship involved in creating these ancient masterpieces. We will uncover what these lost textiles can tell us about trade, technology, social hierarchy, and even the spiritual beliefs of one of history's greatest civilizations. This is a search for a ghostly, beautiful legacy, a quest to understand not just how the Egyptians built their monuments, but how they lived within them, adorned in colors and patterns we can only begin to imagine. Get ready to see ancient Egypt in a completely new light as we unravel the threads of a mystery woven into the very fabric of time. To grasp why these lost patterns matter so deeply, we first need to understand the profound role that textiles played in every layer of Egyptian society. This wasn't a culture that viewed cloth as a simple, utilitarian necessity. From the coarsest worker's tunic to the most diaphanous gown of a queen, textiles were a language, a silent, powerful code communicating wealth, power, and piety. Let's start with the most visible function, social status. In ancient Egypt, what you wore literally defined who you were. The quality of the linen, the fineness of the weave, and the complexity of any decorative elements were immediate indicators of your place in the hierarchy. A common farmer or laborer would have worn a simple, rough loincloth or kilt, woven from thick, durable flax threads. It was purely functional, designed for a life of physical toil. But as you moved up the social ladder, the fabric changed dramatically. A noble or a high-ranking official would have worn garments of incredibly fine linen, so sheer it was often described as being woven from air. This wasn't just about comfort, it was a blatant display of wealth. Producing such delicate cloth required an immense amount of labor and skill. The flax had to be beaten to a pulp, the threads spun impossibly thin, and the weaving done on looms by highly trained artisans. The whiteness of the linen was also a crucial status symbol. Pure, bright white linen was difficult to achieve and maintain, signifying that the wearer was far removed from manual labor and the grime of everyday life. Beyond daily attire, textiles were absolutely central to the Egyptian worldview of the afterlife, making them fundamental to their most famous practice, mummification. The journey to eternity was literally wrapped in linen. A single mummification could require hundreds of square yards of fabric, used to meticulously wrap the body. create protective amulets placed between the layers, and form the cartonnage cases that became the painted mummy masks. This linen was often specially produced and even inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, turning the very cloth into a magical shield for the soul. The bandages themselves were not random rags. They were part of a sacred ritual, with the wrapping pattern and the quality of the cloth believed to hold protective power. The wealthier the individual, the more elaborate and higher quality these burial linens would be, sometimes even being recycled from temple vestments, imbuing them with additional divine favor. This leads us to the economic engine behind it all. Linen production was one of the pillars of the state. Unlike a cottage industry, the cultivation of flax and the weaving of cloth were largely controlled by the palace and the great temple estates. Vast tracts of land were dedicated to growing flax, and the production process from harvesting the plants to spinning, weaving, and bleaching the final cloth was a massive, organized operation. This state-controlled system ensured a steady supply of linen for the court, the priesthood, and for trade. Linen was, in effect, a form of currency. It was used to pay workers who built the pyramids and tombs. Records from the village of Deir el-Medina show artisans were compensated with bolts of linen. It was also a major export commodity, traded throughout the Mediterranean for precious goods like cedar wood from Lebanon and olive oil from Crete. The entire economy, from the humblest field hand to the pharaoh's treasury, was threaded together by the production and distribution of this single, incredible material. So when we talk about a lost textile pattern, we're not just discussing a decorative motif. We are potentially looking at a lost symbol of royal power, a forgotten ritual design meant to guide a soul through the underworld, or the trademark of a state-run workshop that clothed a nation and funded an empire. So, with that understanding of linen's immense importance, what actual evidence has managed to survive the relentless passage of time? When we peer into the archaeological record, we are met with a fascinating and somewhat sobering reality. The vast majority of the textile fragments that have been unearthed are not the vibrantly colored, intricately patterned masterpieces we might hope for. Instead, we find a legacy written in shades of white and beige, simple, sturdy, and often undyed linen cloth. This is the foundation, the raw material of Egyptian clothing and burial practice, and its survival is due to a perfect, if bittersweet, alignment of environment and custom. The primary reason we have any of these ancient fabrics at all comes down to one word: tombs. The Egyptian obsession with the afterlife, with providing for the soul's eternal journey, created a unique set of circumstances for preservation. The dry, arid climate of the desert burial sites acted as a natural desiccant, sucking the moisture out of organic materials and preventing the bacteria and fungi that would normally cause cloth to rot and disintegrate. In the sealed, stable environment of a deep tomb, protected from sunlight, water, and air, linen could lie dormant for thousands of years. But even within the tomb, there was a hierarchy of survival. The textiles that had the best chance were those that served a direct, practical purpose in the mummification process itself. Think of the millions of yards of mummy wrappings, the bandages used to carefully swaddle the body. These were not meant to be seen or admired in the same way a ceremonial robe would be. They were functional, a necessary part of the ritual. Because of this, they were produced in staggering quantities. They were the workhorse textiles of the mortuary cult, and their sheer volume means that statistically, they are the most likely to be found. Furthermore, the very nature of these burial linens contributed to their longevity. They were often woven to be strong and durable, not necessarily fine and delicate. A thicker, coarser thread is less prone to fraying and disintegration over the centuries than an impossibly thin, gauzy one. Many of the surviving examples are from the inner layers of mummy bundles, protected from light and minor abrasion by the outer layers. We also find other utilitarian textiles in tombs, placed there as grave goods for the deceased to use in the next life. This includes simple tunics, loincloths, sheets, and even the sails from funerary boats. These items were meant for eternal use, but they were often of a practical, everyday quality. The truly luxurious items, the sheer, pleated dresses, the colorful, patterned sashes, the elaborate, beaded net dresses were likely worn in life and may not have been deemed as essential for the tomb. or if they were included, their delicate nature made them far more vulnerable. The contrast is stark. We have the plain, white canvas, but the brilliant painting that once lay upon it has, for the most part, faded into oblivion. This surviving linen legacy is both a gift and a puzzle. It gives us the foundational vocabulary of Egyptian textiles, but it also whispers of all the beautiful, complex grammar that has been lost. But this legacy of white and beige tells only half the story, and perhaps the less exciting half at that. The true vibrancy of ancient Egyptian textiles lies in the hunt for color, a detective story pieced together from faint chemical traces and artistic representations that scream of a world drenched in hues now lost to our eyes. If the plain linen is the skeleton, then the dyes and patterns were the very flesh and blood of their textile art. The first major clue comes from the tomb paintings themselves. Walk through any major Egyptian tomb or temple, and you are immediately struck by a riot of color on the walls. Nobles and pharaohs are shown wearing garments covered in intricate, repeating patterns, elaborate geometric designs, stylized floral motifs like lotus blossoms and papyrus umbels, and even intricate beadwork rendered in paint. These aren't just artistic fantasies, they are detailed records of the fashions of the day. We see dresses with colorful sashes, kilts with decorated hems, and shawls filled with complex, woven-in designs. The artists took great care to depict these details, telling us unequivocally that patterned, colorful clothing was not just a possibility, but a reality for the elite. The logical question then is, if these colorful textiles existed, where did they go? Why don't we find them? The answer lies in the fundamental chemistry of ancient dyes. The most common and vibrant colors came from organic sources: plants, insects, and mollusks. Think of a brilliant red from madder root, a vibrant yellow from safflower or pomegranate rind, a deep blue from the indigo plant, or a legendary purple from the mucus of the murex sea snail. These organic compounds are incredibly fragile. Over centuries, exposed to even minute amounts of light, moisture, or oxygen, their complex molecules break down. The color simply fades away, leaving behind only the pale, off-white hue of the underlying linen. It's a cruel trick of preservation. The cloth itself can survive, but the brilliant color that once brought it to life vanishes without a trace. However, all is not lost. Modern archaeology has developed tools to see this invisible world. Using advanced techniques like liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, scientists can take a seemingly plain fragment of ancient linen and analyze it at a molecular level. They wash the sample with solvents and can detect the microscopic, mineralized residues of the original dye compounds that have bonded to the linen fibers. It's like finding the ghost of a color, and these analyses have yielded spectacular results. On fragments of cloth from the tomb of Tutankhamun, for instance, researchers have detected traces of alizarin, a key component of madder root, proving his burial linens were once a rich red. Elsewhere, traces of indigo have been found, confirming the Egyptians knew and used this prized blue dye. Sometimes, the evidence is more indirect, but just as telling. In many burials, archaeologists find faience beads, those beautiful, glazed ceramic beads, still in place on a collar or a dress. The linen of the dress itself has decayed, but the beads remain, often sewn onto the fabric in a specific, elaborate pattern. By mapping the position of these beads, we can reconstruct the stunning, complex net dresses that would have shimmered with color and movement, a fashion statement that combined textile art with jewelry. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for the importance of color comes from the attempts to mimic it when the real thing was too expensive or unavailable. The Egyptians were masters of creating pigments for paint, and they used these same minerals to color other materials. We find evidence of linen that was painted or stamped with patterns using mineral-based pigments like red ochre, yellow orpiment, or Egyptian blue, a synthetic pigment invented by the Egyptians themselves. While not a dye that penetrates the fiber, this shows a powerful desire for decorated cloth. Furthermore, they practice tapestry weave, a technique where different colored threads are woven directly into the fabric to create a permanent, inlaid pattern. A stunning example of this survival is the so-called lion strangler tunic from the Roman period in Egypt, which features a vivid, woven scene. While this is from a later era, the technique itself was known much earlier. All these clues, the tomb paintings, the chemical ghosts of dyes, the reconstructed beadwork, and the painted fabrics, converge to paint a picture that is the absolute opposite of a monochrome world. They reveal an ancient Egypt that was deeply chromatic, where status and beauty were expressed not just in the fineness of the linen, but in the brilliance of its color and the sophistication of its pattern, a vibrant tapestry of life that has, for the most part, faded into a tantalizing whisper. This brings us to our most vivid and accessible window into this lost world of color and design, the walls of the tombs themselves. While the physical fabrics have largely decayed, the ancient Egyptians left us a detailed visual archive, a permanent record of their sartorial splendor intended to last for eternity. The tomb paintings and reliefs were not mere decoration. They were functional magic, designed to provide the deceased with all the pleasures and necessities of life in the next world. And central to that ideal existence was the possession and display of magnificent clothing. The artists, therefore, took extraordinary care in depicting the textiles, recording with meticulous precision the very patterns and details that we so desperately wish we could find preserved in linen. To understand the richness of this archive, let's step into the tomb of a high official, someone like Nebamun from the 18th dynasty. The famous fragments of his tomb paintings, now in the British Museum, are a riot of life and color, and the clothing is a key part of the story. Look at the women in the banquet scene. They are depicted wearing long, white, form-fitting dresses, but it's the details that captivate. These gowns are not plain. Many are shown with a complex, delicate pattern of feathers or intricate beadwork rendered directly onto the fabric in the painting. This wasn't an artistic whim. It was a depiction of a real, highly prized garment known as a feather dress, likely created from a net of faience beads woven to resemble feathers, symbolizing the protective embrace of the goddess Isis. The artists have frozen in time the shimmer and texture of an outfit that has completely vanished from the archaeological record. Beyond these special garments, the tomb walls are filled with more everyday indicators of sophisticated textile design. Look at the kilts and sashes worn by noblemen. They are frequently shown with elaborate fringes and decorated hems. A simple kilt might have a hemline featuring a repeating pattern of colorful spirals or lotus buds. A wide sash tied around the waist could be filled with a geometric grid pattern or rows of stylized symbols. These weren't just random marks, they were status symbols woven or painted directly onto the fabric, announcing the wearer's refined taste and wealth. The precision of these depictions is remarkable. In the tomb of Mena, a scribe, you can see the pleating of his transparent linen gown so finely rendered that you can almost feel the crispness of the fabric. This attention to detail tells us that the pattern and the drape of the cloth were considered essential aspects of a person's identity, important enough to be magically recreated for eternity. The reliefs in the tomb of the Vizier Mereruka from the Old Kingdom provide another fascinating layer. Here, we see vast scenes of daily life, including the entire process of linen production, from harvesting flax to weaving on looms. But we also see the end product. The figures of Mereruka and his family are shown in garments with clear, distinct patterns. This serves a dual purpose. It shows his authority over a major economic industry, and it ensures that he and his family are perpetually clad in the finest, most beautifully decorated attire the world could offer. The patterns themselves are often symbolic. Repeating lotus and papyrus motifs weren't just pretty. They represented Upper and Lower Egypt, a unification motif. The use of the jed pillar symbol or the ankh on a garment could have served a protective, amuletic function, weaving magic directly into the very cloth that touched the skin. What these paintings and reliefs ultimately provide is a corrective to the silent, beige fragments we find in the ground. They shout where the archaeology can only whisper. They confirm that the ancient Egyptian aesthetic was not one of minimalist purity, but one of elaborate, symbolic, and colorful decoration. The artists documented these details because they were fundamental to the concept of an ideal, prosperous afterlife. A soul needed to be clothed in garments of power and beauty, and by painting these intricate patterns onto the tomb walls with such care, they were ensuring that the magic would hold, that the vibrant, living fabric of their world would never truly be lost. One of the most captivating and tangible pieces of evidence in this entire mystery brings together the worlds of textiles, jewelry, and funerary art into a single, stunning artifact: the faience bead net dress. Imagine uncovering a mummy and finding, instead of woven cloth, a sheath of thousands of tiny, glazed ceramic beads, strung together in a complex diamond grid pattern, draping the body from shoulders to ankles like a second skin of shimmering blue and green. This is not a fantasy. Several of these exquisite net dresses have been discovered, most famously on mummies from the Middle Kingdom. They present us with a breathtaking object, but also with a profound question. Why bury someone in a garment made of beads, and what does this tell us about the fabrics we have lost? The prevailing and most compelling theory is that these bead dresses are not replacements for clothing, but rather direct and permanent replicas of them. They are the eternal, indestructible versions of elaborate, perishable textile garments that were the height of fashion for elite women in life. Think about the delicate, form-fitting linen dresses depicted on tomb walls, the ones often shown with an all-over pattern that suggests texture and complexity. It is highly likely that in life, the wealthiest women wore dresses made from a technique involving beadwork sewn directly onto a fine linen ground. This would have created a garment of incredible luxury, a dress that shimmered and moved with a sound like rustling leaves, catching the light with every step. The linen base provided the structure and modesty, while the intricate beadwork displayed immense wealth and artistry. But in the tomb, that linen base was the fatal flaw. Over centuries, the linen threads holding the beads together would inevitably rot and disintegrate. The beads would simply collapse into a disordered pile at the bottom of the coffin, their original form and beauty lost forever. The ancient Egyptians, masters of planning for eternity, devised a brilliant solution. They recreated the entire garment out of beads alone, weaving the faience beads together with wire or strong cord into a self-supporting net. This clever innovation removed the perishable element entirely. The faience, a sintered quartz ceramic, is virtually indestructible in the dry tomb environment. It would not decay, fade, or crumble. The dress, in its perfect, beaded form, would last as long as the stone of the pyramids themselves, ensuring the deceased was magically provided with this symbol of high status and beauty for all eternity. The choice of faience itself is deeply symbolic. Its vibrant turquoise and blue-green hues were associated with fertility, new life, and the divine. To be clothed in a sheath of faience was to be wrapped in the colors of regeneration and rebirth, a potent magical shield for the journey through the afterlife. When we look at the pattern of these net dresses, the diamond grid, we can start to extrapolate what the original textile might have looked like. A diamond mesh is a very efficient structure for a beaded net, but it also strongly resembles certain types of woven or knotted textile patterns. It's entirely plausible that the bead dress is mimicking a specific type of knotted net dress that was worn over a fine linen shift. Alternatively, the grid could represent the underlying structure onto which more complex patterns were applied in the living version. Perhaps the original linen dresses had beads arranged in more intricate motifs, rosettes, spirals, or even hieroglyphs within the diamond framework. But for the funerary version, the simpler, more robust grid pattern was chosen for practicality and durability. The very existence of these objects forces us to reimagine the sensory experience of ancient Egyptian fashion. It wasn't just about visual appearance, it was about sound and movement. A woman wearing a fully beaded garment would have moved with a soft, continuous rustle, an audible announcement of her presence and status. The faience net dress, silent in its display case today, once represented a world alive with sound and shimmering motion. This theory transforms our understanding of the archaeological record. The bead net dress is no longer just a curious, standalone artifact. It becomes a fossilized imprint, a negative space that outlines the shape of something far more ephemeral. It is the enduring skeleton of a vanished textile masterpiece. Every diamond in the grid, every shimmering blue bead, is a silent testament to a lost art form of incredible sophistication. It proves that the Egyptians valued complex, composite textiles so highly that they went to extraordinary lengths to engineer a permanent version for the afterlife. So, when we stand before one of these net dresses in a museum, we are not just looking at a beautiful beaded garment. We are looking straight through it, glimpsing the ghost of an elaborate, luxurious, and utterly vanished linen dress, a whisper of daily life and high fashion that has otherwise completely disintegrated, leaving behind only this brilliant, eternal echo. But to truly appreciate the artistry hinted at by these paintings and bead dresses, we need to step into the workshop and understand the very machinery that brought these textiles to life, the loom. The sophistication of the patterns the Egyptians could create was directly tethered to the technology at their disposal, and their journey in weaving technology is a fascinating story of innovation within constraints. The foundational tool for most of Egyptian history was the horizontal ground loom, a deceptively simple device that was, in fact, a marvel of engineering for its time. Picture two wooden beams, held parallel to each other a few feet apart and pegged directly into the ground. Between these beams, the warp threads, the lengthwise foundation of the fabric, were stretched taut. The weaver would then crouch or kneel on the ground, manually passing the weft thread, the crosswise thread, over and under the warp threads using a shuttle. After each pass, they would use a wooden beater to compact the new weft thread tightly against the previous ones, creating a dense, strong cloth. This horizontal loom was brilliant in its simplicity and portability, perfectly suited for the climate and the scale of both domestic and state-sponsored production. However, this ground loom had inherent limitations that directly impacted pattern complexity, because the warp threads were fixed in place, creating a simple, plain weave, where the weft goes over one warp thread and under the next in a consistent pattern, was straightforward. But to weave a complex design, like a picture or a detailed geometric motif, you need the ability to selectively lift individual warp threads to create a pattern. On a horizontal loom, this was an immensely laborious process. To create even a basic striped pattern, the weaver would have to manually pick up and separate specific colored warp threads for every single pass of the shuttle. For anything more intricate, it would require a second person, an assistant, to sit on the other side of the loom and manually lift bundles of warp threads according to a pre-planned pattern. This was a slow, painstaking, and eye-straining process. The complexity of a pattern was therefore limited by human endurance and the number of people you could assign to a single loom. A highly detailed tapestry woven scene, where different colored weft threads are woven back and forth only in specific areas to build up an image, would have been an incredibly time-consuming and expensive endeavor, reserved only for the most elite and ceremonial of garments. This technological constraint helps explain the prevalence of certain design types we see in Egyptian art. The repeating geometric patterns, the bands of spirals or lotus buds on the hems of kilts, are exactly the kind of designs that are manageable on this type of loom. They are linear and repetitive, allowing the weaver to fall into a rhythm. The true revolution in Egyptian weaving came with the introduction of the vertical loom, a technology that likely appeared during the New Kingdom, possibly through increased contact with other cultures in the Near East. The vertical loom, as the name suggests, stood upright. This was a monumental shift. It was easier on the weaver's body, allowing them to work standing up. More importantly, some versions of the vertical loom incorporated a system of heddles. A heddle is a cord or rod with an eye in the center through which a warp thread is passed. By grouping heddles together and attaching them to a single bar, the weaver could lift an entire set of warp threads with a single motion. This was the birth of true pattern weaving. By using multiple sets of heddles to control different groupings of warp threads, the weaver could create complex, repeating patterns like twills and diamonds with a speed and precision that was impossible on the horizontal loom. The development of the vertical loom with heddles was as significant for textile production as the invention of the printing press was for writing. It democratized complexity. What was once an arduous, bespoke craft could now be produced with greater efficiency. This technological leap likely correlates directly with the explosion of intricate textile designs we see depicted in New Kingdom tomb paintings. The elaborate, all-over patterns on the gowns of nobles were no longer just painterly fantasies. They were now within the technical reach of the weaver's art. Furthermore, the Egyptians mastered other sophisticated techniques to overcome the limitations of their looms. They practiced a form of weft wrapping, or sprang, a method akin to braiding that could create elastic, sock-like garments with intricate, predetermined patterns. They were also adept at pile weaving, looping the weft threads to create a soft, plush surface, a technique used for certain types of blankets and rugs. The evidence of these advanced methods tells us that Egyptian weavers were not passive recipients of their technology. They were active innovators, constantly pushing the boundaries of their tools to bring more beauty and complexity into the world, one painstaking thread at a time. Now let's turn our attention to the very pinnacle of this textile artistry, the royal wardrobe of the pharaohs themselves. When we visualize an Egyptian king, we often see the stark, iconic symbols of power: the striped Nemes headcloth, the crook and flail crossed over the chest, and the postures of eternal, rigid authority carved in stone. But beneath those timeless symbols were garments of cloth, and for the pharaoh, clothing was far more than a marker of status. It was a vital component of his divine role, a wearable expression of his power over the cosmos. The most fundamental and enduring piece of royal attire was the shendit, a simple triangular kilt that appears in statues and reliefs from the earliest dynasties to the last. Wrapped around the hips and tied at the waist, its basic form was shared by commoners and kings alike. Yet for the pharaoh, the simplicity of the shape was a canvas for unparalleled complexity. The shendit was often made from the finest, whitest linen available, but it's the details we must focus on. In countless depictions, the front apron of the royal shendit is not smooth. It is meticulously pleated, pressed into dozens of fine, sharp, accordion-like folds that would catch the light and move with a crisp, rustling sound. This pleating was a technological marvel, requiring immense skill to set and maintain, and it created a living, shimmering surface that set the god-king visually apart from all others. Beyond the kilt, the pharaoh's wardrobe included more elaborate garments for specific ceremonial functions. We see them in temple reliefs wearing long, transparent, pleated robes that flow over one shoulder, creating a layered, elegant silhouette. These were not garments for battle or manual labor. They were vestments for performing sacred rites. The transparency of the linen was a deliberate choice, showcasing the perfection of the royal form while simultaneously demonstrating a mastery over material, the ability to transform humble flax into what was essentially woven air. But here lies the core of our mystery. While the carvings and paintings show us the cut and drape of these clothes with perfect clarity, they only hint at their potential for color and pattern. The artists, working primarily in stone and paint, often rendered these divine garments in a symbolic white or a single, flat color for clarity. This artistic convention is our biggest obstacle. It is almost certain that these royal vestments were not monochromatic. A pharaoh presiding over the said festival, a jubilee celebrating the renewal of his reign, would have been a spectacle of color and pattern. His pleated kilt or flowing robe was very likely embellished with exclusive, woven-in or embroidered designs that have left no physical trace. What might these lost royal patterns have depicted? We can make educated guesses based on the symbols that surrounded the king in every other aspect of his life. It is highly probable that his clothing featured intricate repeating motifs of the royal titulary, the carduch encircling his name, woven in a subtle, golden thread. We might imagine borders filled with the ankh, the symbol of life, or the jed pillar, representing stability. The vulture goddess Nekabet and the cobra goddess Wajet, the protective patrons of Upper and Lower Egypt, could have been embroidered onto his shoulders, their wings outstretched across his chest. Another compelling possibility involves the use of a specific, and now legendary, color, royal purple. While more famously associated with the Phoenicians, there is evidence that the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, through trade and conquest, had access to the precious dye from the murex snail. For a pharaoh to be adorned in a garment dyed with this incredibly rare and expensive color would have been a powerful, visceral statement of his wealth and global connections, a hue so exclusive it would have been forbidden to anyone else. The evidence for this hidden opulence, while circumstantial, is persuasive. Look at the tomb of Tutankhamun. Among his vast collection of grave goods, there were delicate sandals made of leather and wood, inlaid with marquetry that depicts the king's bound foreign captives. On the sole of these sandals, every time he took a step, he would literally tread upon the images of his enemies. This level of symbolic detail, this obsession with embedding power into every single item, makes it almost unthinkable that his actual clothing was plain. Furthermore, the few textile fragments found in his tomb, though now faded, showed traces of red dye from madder root. If a young pharaoh's burial linens were colored, how much more vibrant and complex must have been the ceremonial robes he wore in life. The royal wardrobe was a language, and every pleat, every fringe, every hidden pattern was a word in a sentence proclaiming divine right, eternal stability, and cosmic power. The stark white garments we see in the art are likely a simplified hieroglyph for a reality that was dazzlingly, brilliantly complex. A royal fabric woven with threads of both linen and meaning, now almost entirely lost to the world. Stepping away from the dazzling, symbolic world of the pharaoh's wardrobe, we find ourselves in the sun-baked fields and dusty streets of everyday Egypt. This is the world of the commoner, the farmer, the artisan, and the laborer, whose clothing tells a very different, yet equally important, story. While the king's linen was woven from air and pleated to perfection, the clothing of the vast majority of Egyptians was defined by one overriding principle: practicality. Their garments were tools for survival, designed for freedom of movement, durability, and protection from the relentless sun. The standard attire for a working man was remarkably simple and consistent across millennia: a basic loincloth or a short kilt, known as a shendit, but one made from coarse, unbleached linen, often little more than a wrapped rectangle of cloth tied at the waist. For women, a simple, ankle-length, sheath-like dress, often just a tube of fabric with straps over the shoulders, was the norm. These were not garments for display. They were a second skin for a life of physical toil, from tending flax in the fields to hauling stone blocks for the monuments that would glorify others. The texture of this daily life was woven from the thickest, sturdiest flax threads. This was not the delicate, translucent linen of the elite. It was a tough, scratchy fabric, woven on those same horizontal ground looms, but with a much wider set, meaning the threads were spaced farther apart, creating a looser, more breathable weave. The color was almost universally the natural, beige to brownish hue of unbleached flax. Bleaching linen to a bright white was a time-consuming process involving exposure to the sun and repeated washings, a luxury of time and labor that a farming family simply could not afford. Their cloth was functional, and its quality reflected their station. There's a powerful, silent testimony in this. The very coarseness of the fabric that made it unsuitable for a royal ceremony is precisely what has allowed so many fragments of it to survive in the archaeological record. The plain, rough textiles found in the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, or in simple pit graves, are the direct, tangible legacy of the common Egyptian. They are the silent majority of the textile record, speaking volumes about a life of hard work. This leads us to a compelling and often overlooked question. Was the world of the common Egyptian entirely devoid of color and pattern? Did their aesthetic sensibilities begin and end with beige? The evidence suggests a more nuanced and surprisingly vibrant picture, especially when we consider the role of special occasions. Even in the most arduous lives, there were moments of celebration, religious festivals, and family milestones like weddings or births. It is difficult to believe that for these events, people would not have wanted to adorn themselves in their best. So, what did their best look like? While they certainly did not have access to the sheer, pleated linens or intricate beadwork of the elite, there is strong reason to believe they found ways to incorporate pattern and color into their lives. One of the most accessible methods would have been through the use of simple accessories. A plain linen kilt could be transformed by a brightly colored woven sash or a belt. A woman's simple dress could be adorned with a beaded collar or a garland of fresh flowers for a festival. These small touches of personal adornment would have provided a splash of color and individuality without the immense cost of an entirely patterned garment. Furthermore, we have to consider the ingenuity of domestic production. While the state controlled large-scale linen production for the elite and for trade, weaving was also a common household skill. In their own homes, using smaller, more manageable looms, people could have experimented. They could have created stripes by using naturally darker flax threads alongside lighter ones, or by weaving in a single colored thread they might have acquired through barter. They might have practiced embroidery, adding a simple, repeating motif to the hem of a tunic or around the neckline of a dress. The technology for creating patterns existed. It was the cost and time of the materials that were the limiting factors. A small amount of precious dyed thread, perhaps from madder root for red or safflower for yellow, could go a long way when used as a decorative accent rather than for an entire garment. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the funerary practices of ordinary people. Even in modest burials, archaeologists sometimes find traces of something beyond the purely utilitarian. A simple tunic placed in a grave might have a fringed edge, a small but deliberate decorative detail. In some burials, we find evidence of linen that was painted or stamped with simple designs using readily available ochre or other mineral pigments. This wasn't the woven-in color of the elite. It was a more affordable way to make a garment special, to mark it as fit for the journey to the afterlife. The very fact that people were buried with these slightly enhanced items tells us that they held value. They were the Sunday best of ancient Egypt, the one nice outfit reserved for the most important occasions in both life and death. So, while the daily reality for most was one of simple, durable, and plain clothing, it is almost certain that tucked away in a wooden chest or a pottery jar, there was a belt, a sash, or a tunic with a little bit of color. A small, proud expression of personal beauty and celebration. A humble but powerful thread in the vast and colorful tapestry of ancient Egyptian life. But to fully grasp the evolution of Egyptian textile art, we cannot view it in isolation. The Nile Valley was not a sealed chamber, but a dynamic hub at the center of a vast web of international trade and diplomacy. As Egyptian ships sailed the Mediterranean and its armies marched into neighboring lands, they didn't just bring back tribute and treasure, they brought back ideas. Contact with other advanced cultures, particularly the Minoans of Crete, the Mycenaeans of Greece, and the Nubians to the south, opened a pipeline for artistic exchange that almost certainly left its mark on the looms and dye vats of Egypt, introducing new colors, patterns, and techniques that may have flourished briefly before vanishing from the record. Consider the Minoans, the brilliant, seafaring civilization of Bronze Age Crete. Frescoes from the Palace of Knossos reveal a society that adored vibrant, intricate pattern. Their art is filled with swirling spirals, interlocking geometric designs, and naturalistic motifs like octopuses and lilies, all rendered in a stunning palette. We know from archaeological evidence that Egypt and Crete were active trading partners. Egyptian stone vessels and scarabs have been found in Crete, and Minoan pottery has been discovered in Egyptian contexts. It is almost inconceivable that among the goods exchanged, Minoan textiles were not included. Imagine a Minoan merchant unrolling a bolt of cloth in a Theban marketplace, a fabric alive with a complex, running spiral motif unlike anything an Egyptian weaver had seen, or dyed with a particularly vivid shade of saffron yellow. Egyptian artisans, always keen to adopt and adapt, would have seen the potential. They might have begun to incorporate these foreign spiral patterns into the borders of their own garments, creating a new hybrid style that reflected Egypt's growing cosmopolitan identity. The same holds true for the Mycenaeans, who succeeded the Minoans. Their art features bold, stylized patterns like the iconic wave and whorl motif. A fragment of cloth with such a design, found in an Egyptian tomb, would be a smoking gun for cultural exchange. But the organic nature of textiles means such a discovery is incredibly rare. The influence may be there, woven into the very fabric of history, but the evidence has simply decayed away. This exchange of ideas was not a one-way street. Egypt was also an exporter of both raw materials and finished luxury goods. The most significant Egyptian textile export was, of course, its high-quality linen. But they also exported their knowledge, and perhaps even their artisans. There is fascinating evidence from the site of Tel el-Deba, the ancient Avaris in the Nile Delta, which was a major hub for Canaanite and Minoan traders. Here, archaeologists have found Minoan-style frescoes painted on the walls of palaces, suggesting a direct, physical presence of Aegean artists in Egypt. If painters could travel, why not weavers? It is a compelling thought that a Minoan master weaver might have been employed in an Egyptian workshop, teaching local artisans how to create those complex, multi-hetal patterns that would later become more common in the New Kingdom. This kind of direct knowledge transfer would have been the fastest way for a new weaving technique to take root. The resulting textiles would have been unique hybrids, Egyptian in material and overall form, but Minoan in their intricate, woven soul. These would have been the most fashionable, cutting-edge garments of their day, worn by the elite to display their international connections. And precisely because they were novel and perhaps tied to a specific, fleeting period of intense contact, they are the least likely to have survived in an identifiable form, leaving their existence to be inferred rather than proven. Perhaps the most tangible foreign influence comes from the south, from the land of Nubia, modern-day Sudan. Nubia was a source of immense wealth for Egypt, providing gold, ivory, ebony, and enslaved people. But it was also a source of powerful cultural and artistic influence. The Nubians were masters of a specific craft, the production of vibrant, color-fast dyes. While the Egyptians used organic dyes, the Nubians had access to and knowledge of rich mineral pigments. More importantly, they possessed deep expertise in the use of tannins and mordant chemical agents that bind dye to fabric, preventing it from washing out or fading quickly. This was a technological advantage. An Egyptian textile merchant acquiring a bolt of Nubian cloth would have been astonished by the depth and resilience of its color, a red that did not pinken or a blue that did not gray after a few washes. The desire to replicate this would have driven Egyptian dyers to experiment, possibly leading them to discover new local plants or to improve their own mordanting processes using alum, a mineral they had access to. This technological cross-pollination could have sparked a brief, golden age of color in Egyptian textiles, a period where colors were richer and more durable than ever before. Yet, because the underlying chemistry was improving, not changing fundamentally, it would be nearly impossible for us to distinguish a Nubian-influenced red from any other red in the faded, molecular ghosts left on a textile fragment. The ultimate example of a foreign import that may have left no physical trace is the legendary Tyrian purple, the celebrated dye of the Phoenicians. Derived from the mucus of the murex sea snail, the production of this dye was an industrial scale, foul-smelling, and incredibly expensive process. A single gram of dye required the harvesting of thousands of snails. The result was a color that did not fade. Instead, it deepened and became more brilliant with exposure to sunlight and wear. It was, by weight, worth more than silver. By the New Kingdom, through trade networks with the Levant, this precious dye began to trickle into Egypt. For a pharaoh like Ramesses II, a man who understood the power of spectacle, a ceremonial robe dyed in true Tyrian purple would have been the ultimate status symbol. It was a color that shouted of vast wealth, of control over far-flung trade routes, and of a connection to the great kingdoms across the sea. A single such garment would have been a treasure beyond compare. But this is the cruelest twist in our mystery. If such a robe ever existed, its sheer value and rarity mean it would have been worn on only the most sacred occasions, carefully stored, and almost certainly passed down from pharaoh to pharaoh. It would have been used and reused until it was threadbare, and then, because the dye was so precious, the fibers might have been unraveled and rewoven into something else. The chances of it being placed in a tomb, where we might find it, are infinitesimally small. So, one of the most dramatic and influential foreign imports in the history of textiles could have been present in ancient Egypt, influencing fashion and status at the very highest levels, while leaving behind not a single shred of physical evidence for us to find today. This brings us to a dimension far beyond mere decoration, to the very heart of why these patterns mattered so profoundly. In a world where the divine and the mortal were deeply intertwined, where every aspect of life was connected to a larger cosmic order, the symbols woven into a garment were not just aesthetic choices, they were a form of wearable magic, a layer of spiritual armor, and a declaration of faith. To understand these lost textiles, we must learn to read their symbolic language, to see the lotus not just as a flower, but as a promise of rebirth, and the jed pillar not as a simple shape, but as the backbone of the god Osiris himself. Let's begin with the natural world, which provided the ancient Egyptians with their most potent and recurring symbols. The lotus flower, or water lily, is a perfect example. In nature, each night the lotus closes its blossoms and sinks beneath the water, only to re-emerge and open once again with the dawn. To the Egyptian mind, this was a powerful, daily metaphor for the sun itself, which was reborn each morning, and for the concept of resurrection and new life. Now, imagine this symbol not just painted on a tomb wall, but woven into the very fabric of a dress or a shawl. A high-ranking priestess or queen wearing a gown embroidered with a repeating lotus pattern was not merely adorned with a pretty floral design. She was literally clothing herself in the concept of regeneration. With every step, the lotuses on her garment would shift and move, a constant, magical reinforcement of her connection to the cycle of creation and her own hope for rebirth in the afterlife. The same holds true for the papyrus plant, which grew in dense, lush thickets along the Nile. The papyrus symbolized the vibrant, fertile world of Lower Egypt, the northern Nile Delta. A pattern featuring papyrus umbels, therefore, was a direct reference to the fecundity of the land, to growth, and to the primeval marsh from which life first emerged. A pharaoh wearing a kilt with a papyrus design on its hem was symbolically wrapping himself in the fertility of his own kingdom, proclaiming his role as the guardian of Egypt's agricultural abundance. Moving from the natural to the explicitly divine, we encounter symbols that functioned as direct conduits to the gods. The Ankh, the iconic looped cross, is one of the most recognizable Egyptian symbols, representing the word for life. But it wasn't just a word, it was the essence of life force, both in this world and the next. Depictions often show gods holding an ankh to the nose of a pharaoh, gifting him the breath of life. If this symbol was so powerful when held in a deity's hand, how much more potent might it have been when woven directly into the linen that touched the skin? A tunic with a subtle, all-over pattern of interconnected ankh signs would have been a garment perpetually imbued with the power of life. It would have been a constant, protective field around the wearer, a magical shield against the forces of chaos and death. This wasn't just superstition, it was a deeply held belief in the animating power of symbols. Similarly, the Djed pillar, which resembles a column with crossbars, was intimately associated with the god Osiris, the lord of the underworld and the ultimate symbol of resurrection. The myth tells of Osiris's backbone being represented by the Djed, and ceremonies involved the raising of the Djed pillar, a ritual celebrating stability, endurance, and the triumph of order over chaos. For a high official to have this symbol woven into the border of his ceremonial robe was to align himself with the most fundamental stability of the cosmos and to secure the promise of eternal life through Osiris. He was carrying the backbone of a god on his shoulders, a profound statement of faith and power. This symbolic language extended to creatures of the animal world, which were seen as manifestations of divine attributes. The vulture goddess Nekhabet, the protector of Upper Egypt, was often depicted with her wings outstretched in a gesture of shelter. It's highly plausible that the actual cloaks or shawls of the pharaoh and his queen were woven or embroidered with a pattern of overlapping vulture wings, creating a literal, textile-based representation of the goddess's protection enveloping the royal body. The same could be true for the cobra goddess Wajet, whose rearing form, the uraeus, was already a fixed symbol on the royal crown. A dress with a repeating, undulating cobra pattern along its edge would have been a powerful, mobile extension of that protective power. Even simpler geometric patterns likely held deeper meanings. A common design element in Egyptian art is the zigzag or wave pattern, often used to represent water, specifically the primordial waters of Nun from which all creation arose. A simple tunic with a wavy line pattern at its hem could therefore be interpreted as a symbolic connection to the very source of life, a humble yet profound nod to the cosmic order. The true power of this system likely lay in combination and context. A single symbol was potent, but a pattern that wove multiple symbols together could create a complex magical statement. Imagine a priest's ritual vestment. The main field of the garment might feature a grid of Ankh symbols, the very fabric infused with life. The border could then be a continuous chain of Djed pillars, representing stability. And interspersed throughout, small, blooming lotus flowers could symbolize rebirth. Worn together, this single piece of clothing would become a comprehensive prayer, a wearable text that stated, "I am filled with life, I am surrounded by stability, and I am guaranteed rebirth." It transformed the wearer into a living, breathing ritual object, actively participating in the maintenance of cosmic harmony with every movement. This symbolic layering wasn't reserved solely for the elite in their tombs. While a farmer's tunic would not have been made of the same fine linen, it is entirely possible that a simpler version of this practice existed. A mother might stitch a small, protective saw symbol, representing protection, onto her child's simple linen wrap. A farmer might have a kilt with a faded, painted wave pattern, connecting him to the life-giving Nile that sustained his crops. In this way, the symbolic language of textiles likely permeated all levels of society, from the god-king in his palace to the laborer in his field, each thread woven not just with flax, but with hope, faith, and a deep, abiding connection to an unseen world. Now we arrive at one of the most tantalizing and frustrating chapters in this entire mystery: the possibility that the ancient Egyptians mastered a textile technique so advanced it could transform a simple bolt of linen into a canvas as detailed and vibrant as their finest wall paintings. This is the technique known as tapestry weave. Unlike the simple over and under motion of a plain weave, tapestry is a form of weft-faced weaving. This means the weft threads, the ones that run crosswise, are packed down so densely that they completely cover the warp threads, creating a solid surface of color. The true magic of this method is that the weaver can use multiple colors of weft thread, working them back and forth only in specific areas to build up an image. Think of it like painting with thread, allowing for intricate pictorial scenes, detailed hieroglyphs, and complex geometric borders to be woven directly into the fabric itself, becoming a permanent, inseparable part of the cloth. For a culture that communicated so much through symbolic imagery, tapestry weave would have been the ultimate medium for textile art, a way to literally wear a story or a prayer. Given their artistic sophistication, it seems almost inevitable that the Egyptians would have developed or adopted this technique. The circumstantial evidence for its use is surprisingly strong. Look again at the tomb paintings. Some of the garments depicted on nobles, especially the wide sashes and decorative bands on kilts, feature incredibly crisp, self-contained pictorial elements. We see bound captives, ankh symbols, and even full scenes rendered with a clarity that seems to go beyond simple embroidery or painted on designs. The edges of these motifs are often sharply defined, with one color field sitting directly next to another without any blurring, which is a classic hallmark of tapestry weaving. Furthermore, the Egyptians had the requisite technology. While the horizontal ground loom made complex patterning difficult, the later vertical loom with its heddle system provided the necessary control. More fundamentally, the core principle of tapestry using discontinuous weft to create blocks of color is something they would have understood from other crafts. The technique used to create intricate faience beadwork, where different colored beads are strung together to form an image, is conceptually identical to tapestry, just executed in a different medium. It requires the same meticulous planning and pixel-by-pixel construction of a design. If they could think in these terms for beads and for painted murals, applying that same mindset to threads on a loom is a logical and thrilling possibility. Yet, here is where the mystery deepens into profound frustration. Despite all the logical reasons to believe they used it, direct, undeniable archaeological evidence for tapestry-woven textiles from Pharaonic Egypt is virtually non-existent. This is the core of the problem. We have a handful of textile fragments with complex patterns, but their state of preservation is so poor that it is nearly impossible to determine with absolute certainty whether they were created using true tapestry weave or a different technique, such as embroidery or even a form of weft wrapping. The most famous potential example comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun, a small, decorated linen fragment. Analysis suggests it might be tapestry, but the threads are so fragile and the colors so faded that it remains a subject of debate among textile specialists. This lack of a smoking gun is what makes tapestry weave the ghost at the feast, the most prominent, lost art in our story. Its potential existence is supported by logic and artistic representation, but its physical reality has been erased by time, leaving us with a haunting question mark. The reasons for this complete disappearance are rooted in the very nature of the technique and the Egyptian environment. Tapestry weave, by its definition, is an incredibly time-consuming and expensive process. A single garment with a large tapestry woven panel could have taken a master weaver many months, or even years, to complete. This means such items would have been the absolute pinnacle of luxury, owned only by the pharaoh and his closest circle. They would have been worn on the most significant state and religious occasions, treated as priceless heirlooms, and passed down through generations. They were simply too valuable to be casually placed in a tomb, unlike the millions of yards of simple mummy wrappings, which were produced specifically for burial. A royal tapestry-woven robe was an object for the living, for the display of power in the mortal realm. Consequently, it was far less likely to be sealed away in a dark chamber for eternity. Furthermore, if such a garment was eventually included in a burial, its extreme value would have made it a prime target for tomb robbers across the millennia. A robe woven with gold threads and brilliant colors would have been one of the first things snatched from a plundered burial chamber, lost to the black market of antiquity, and eventually disintegrating through use. Even if a fragment had somehow survived undisturbed in a tomb, its delicate structure made it exceptionally vulnerable. Tapestry weave, especially when used to create fine details, often uses very thin threads. These delicate fibers are the first to succumb to the slight shifts in humidity, the weight of the surrounding burial goods, or the mere passage of time. A tapestry-woven textile is also under inherent physical stress. The different colored weft threads, packed tightly together, can expand and contract at slightly different rates, leading to internal strain and eventual failure of the fabric. Compare this to the plain, sturdy linen of a mummy wrapping. That cloth was woven for strength and durability, with thick, robust threads and a simple, stable structure. It was the workhorse, built to last. Tapestry was the thoroughbred, incredibly beautiful and sophisticated, but also fragile and high maintenance. In the harsh reality of archaeological preservation, the workhorse survives, while the thoroughbred vanishes without a trace. This glaring absence in the Egyptian record is thrown into sharp relief when we look at a later period. From Roman-era Egypt, thanks to the even drier conditions of sites like Akhmim, we have a stunning survival, the so-called lion strangler tunic. This garment features a vivid, detailed tapestry-woven panel of the hero Hercules wrestling the Nemean lion. The technique is flawless, the colors are still vibrant, and it proves that tapestry weave was not only known in Egypt, but executed at a master level. This Roman period evidence acts as both a gift and a torment. It shows us the exact kind of artistic and technical achievement that was possible in the land of the Nile, but it comes centuries after the age of the pharaohs. It doesn't prove that the New Kingdom Egyptians used the technique, but it makes the possibility feel all the more immediate and tragic. It's as if we are looking at a later copy of a lost masterpiece, giving us a glimpse of the heights that may have been reached long before, heights from which no physical evidence remains. The tapestry weave of the pharaohs, if it ever existed, remains the ultimate ghost in the machine, a logical, almost certain conclusion based on everything we know about their culture, forever hovering just beyond the reach of proof, a beautiful and maddening void in the fabric of history. But this entire vibrant world we've been exploring, from the sheerest linen to the most intricate symbolic pattern, has been built upon a single, fundamental material: flax. What happens, then, when we introduce a completely different fiber into the equation? To understand the full scope of lost Egyptian textiles, we must confront a material that stood in stark opposition to linen, a fiber shrouded in ritual taboo and practical complication: wool. The ancient Egyptian relationship with wool is one of the most fascinating and contradictory stories in their entire material culture. A tension between purity and practicality that may have created an entire category of patterned textiles that were both used and deliberately erased from the record. The core of the issue lies in the concept of ritual purity. For the ancient Egyptians, especially the priesthood and those involved in temple ceremonies, cleanliness was not just next to godliness, it was a mandatory state for approaching the divine. Linen, derived from the flax plant, was considered ritually pure. It was a vegetable fiber, clean, cool, and associated with the light of the sun god Ra. Wool, on the other hand, came from an animal. It was seen by many as a potential source of impurity, a substance that could carry the taint of the animal's sweat, dirt, and, by extension, chaos, the very force the gods and their rituals were meant to keep at bay. Numerous religious texts and temple inscriptions explicitly forbid priests from wearing wool while performing their duties. To enter a sacred space clothed in animal fiber would have been a profound sacrilege, an act that could disrupt the delicate balance between the human and divine realms. This deep-seated religious aversion created a powerful cultural preference that echoed throughout society, establishing linen as the default, morally superior fabric for any context with spiritual significance, especially burial. Yet, here is where the story becomes wonderfully complex. The archaeological and artistic evidence makes it abundantly clear that the Egyptians did not simply reject wool outright. They kept vast herds of sheep and goats, primarily for their meat, milk, and skins. It would have been incredibly impractical to simply discard the wool each shearing season. So, what did they do with it? The answer seems to be that wool found its niche in the gritty, everyday world of practicality, far from the purified spaces of the temple. Think about the needs of a soldier on a desert patrol, a merchant on a caravan route through the cold mountains of the Levant, or a farmer on a chilly winter night. Linen, for all its virtues, is a terrible insulator. It's a cool fabric, perfect for the blazing Egyptian summer, but it offers little protection against the cold. Wool, with its crimped fibers that trap body heat, would have been the obvious, logical choice for blankets, cloaks, heavy tunics, and tents. It was the fabric of necessity, of survival in non-ideal conditions. This leads us directly to our central mystery. If wool was being used for these practical purposes, is it not also highly likely that it was decorated? We have established that the Egyptian aesthetic drive for pattern was powerful and pervasive. It seems almost unthinkable that they would weave a heavy wool cloak and leave it a plain, undyed brown. The very practicality of wool might have made it a perfect canvas for bold, colorful patterns. Because it was freed from the strict religious constraints of linen, woolen textiles could have been a space for more playful, experimental, or culturally blended designs. A wool blanket destined for a military outpost might have been woven with strong, simple geometric stripes in madder red and safflower yellow, both for identification and for morale. A trader's heavy cloak, meant for journeys abroad, could have incorporated patterns seen in foreign lands, perhaps the spirals of the Aegean or the stylized animals of the Near East, acting as a form of cultural passport or simply a personal souvenir. The tragic fate of these hypothetical patterned wools is tied directly to their material nature and their social standing. Wool is an animal protein, keratin, which is far more susceptible to insect pests, mold, and bacterial decay than cellulose-based linen. In the damp soil of a settlement or the fluctuating conditions of a living space, a woolen textile would perish much faster than a linen one. But there's a more profound reason for their disappearance. They were likely deemed unfit for the tomb. Since wool was associated with ritual impurity, it would have been deliberately excluded from the funerary assemblage for anyone concerned with a proper afterlife. Why risk your eternal soul by being buried with a ritually unclean material? This means that the very context that has preserved our linen fragments for thousands of years, the sealed, dry tomb, was systematically closed off to wool. The vibrant, patterned woolen textiles of daily life were used, worn out, repurposed as rags, and ultimately discarded in middens or left to decay in habitation sites, where organic preservation is exceedingly rare. They were the textiles of life, not of death, and consequently, they have vanished almost completely. This creates a maddening gap in our understanding. We have countless tomb paintings depicting people in what we assume are linen garments, but how can we be sure? Could some of the thicker, fringed mantles or striped blankets shown in scenes of military life or foreign travel actually be representations of wool? The artists, using the same pigments, would have rendered a brown wool cloak and a brown linen cloak in exactly the same way. We are, in a sense, colorblind to the material. The only direct evidence we have consists of a few precious, rare fragments. In the workers' village at Amarna, a small piece of woven wool was found, proving its use. From some Nubian forts, where Egyptian soldiers were stationed in colder climates, there are traces of wool. But these are tiny, faded ghosts, usually just plain weaves, their colors long since vanished. They are the silent, crumbling representatives of what was almost certainly a rich and varied tradition of patterned woolen cloth. A whole parallel universe of Egyptian textile art that flourished in the barracks, the marketplaces, and the caravan stops. A world of practical beauty that lived, was used, and died with its owners, leaving behind the faintest of echoes in the archaeological record. So if the chemistry of preservation worked against wool, it was an even more formidable foe when it came to capturing the true, vibrant colors of ancient Egyptian clothing. To understand the palette they truly possessed, we have to look not at the faded cloth, but at the living landscape of Egypt itself and the incredible botanical knowledge of its people. The ancient dyers were master chemists of the natural world, transforming common plants, roots, and even insects into a stunning spectrum of hues. For a rich brick red, they turned to the madder root, a plant whose long, thin roots contain a powerful compound called alizarin. By carefully controlling the mordant, the chemical fixative, often alum, they could shift the madder dye from a fiery orange red to a deeper, more somber blood red. For a brilliant, sunny yellow, the petals of the safflower plant were the source. This was a particularly clever process, as the same safflower petals could also produce a pink or red dye, requiring the dyer to carefully wash the yellow pigment out first before using an alkaline solution to extract the red. It was a delicate, multi-stage operation that speaks to a highly refined understanding of chemical properties. And for the color of the Nile and the sky, they had access to a blue dye, likely from the woad plant, which contains the same indigo-producing compounds as its tropical cousin, but could be grown in cooler climates, or they may have imported true indigo from the Levant. With these three primary colors, madder red, safflower yellow, and woad blue, a skilled dyer could mix a vast array of secondary colors. They could create vibrant oranges, earthy browns, and by over-dyeing blue with yellow, a range of greens, a color strongly associated with vitality and new growth. The tragedy and the core of this particular mystery lies in the fundamental chemical nature of these brilliant colors. Every one of these dyes was organic. Their vibrant molecules were built from carbon-based compounds derived from living organisms, and these organic compounds are inherently unstable over long periods of time. They are vulnerable to the very elements that define our world: light, air, and moisture. The complex molecular chains that absorb specific wavelengths of light to create the color we see are gradually broken down by photons from the sun in a process called photodegradation. Oxygen in the air slowly oxidizes the dye molecules, changing their structure and altering their color, often turning them brownish or bleaching them entirely. Even minute, almost undetectable levels of humidity can facilitate chemical reactions that dismantle the color over centuries. This is why a bolt of cloth left in a sunny window will fade in a matter of years. Imagine what millennia in a tomb, even a dry one, can do. The colors didn't just fade. In most cases, they underwent a complete molecular disintegration, vanishing so thoroughly that to the naked eye, the linen appears to have never been colored at all. It's a cruel paradox. The very substances that gave the textiles their life and meaning were the very reason they could not endure. However, this fading was not always a uniform process, and sometimes it leaves behind a tantalizing, ghostly clue. In very rare instances, a textile is found where the dye did not vanish completely, but instead underwent a chemical transformation, leaving a shadow of its former self. A fabric once dyed a rich green, perhaps from a combination of woad blue and safflower yellow, might be discovered with a faint, brownish stain. The yellow component, often the more fugitive of the two, faded away completely, while the more stable blue pigment broke down into a different, discolored compound. To an archaeologist, this faint stain is as significant as a bold color. It's proof that the cloth was not always plain. It confirms that the dyer's art was applied, and it gives scientists a specific chemical signature to look for. This is where modern technology becomes our time machine. Using techniques like high-performance liquid chromatography, researchers can take a tiny, seemingly colorless thread, and analyze it at a molecular level. They can detect the invisible, mineralized residues of alizarin from madder root or indigotin from woad, even when every last vestige of the visible color is gone. These tests have confirmed the use of these dyes on fragments from the tombs of pharaohs, proving that the burial linens of a king like Tutankhamun were once a brilliant red, a color of power and vitality, rather than the quiet beige we see today. This creates a profound shift in how we must visualize the past. The aesthetic of ancient Egypt, as presented by the stark, sun-bleached ruins and the faded artifacts in museum cases, is one of sand, stone, and off-white linen. But the chemical evidence screams otherwise. It reveals a civilization that loved color, that strived for it, and that mastered the complex botany and chemistry to achieve it. The everyday world of an Egyptian city, a temple festival, or a royal procession would have been a far more chromatic and visually dynamic place than the monochrome legacy suggests. The white linens of the elite were not always the statement of minimalist purity we might assume. They were often a background, a canvas, for accessories of brilliant color, a sash of madder red, a shawl of safflower yellow, a beaded collar of faience blue and green. The common perception of an Egypt dressed only in white is a modern illusion, a consequence of chemistry and time. The reality was a society draped in a fading palette, a brilliant explosion of plant-based color that lived, breathed, and shimmered under the Egyptian sun, only to retreat silently back into the earth, leaving behind a world bleached of its vibrancy and a mystery written in invisible ink. And yet, despite all the odds, a handful of remarkable objects have survived to offer us a direct, breathtaking glimpse into that lost world of color. One of the most stunning and informative of these is a fragment known as the Ghurab Shroud. Discovered at the site of Ghurab, a royal harem palace from the New Kingdom, this piece of linen is not a faded ghost or a chemical trace. It is a vibrant, painted canvas that has miraculously endured. Dated to around the 13th century BCE, the shroud is a powerful testament to the fact that the Egyptians did not just weave patterns. They painted them directly onto the fabric, creating wearable art with a painter's brush as well as a weaver's loom. The shroud fragment is a riot of color and activity. Against a creamy linen background, we see a procession of elegant, slender female figures, their bodies painted in a pale, creamy yellow, adorned with elaborate, black, braided wigs. They are depicted in graceful, animated poses, some holding lotus flowers, others musical instruments like the lyre. Their sheer, white garments rendered so skillfully that you can see the form of their bodies beneath the transparent linen. Flanking these figures are bold, geometric borders filled with intricate patterns of spirals, rosettes, and stylized floral motifs, all painted in a rich palette of red, blue, green, and black. This isn't a subtle hint. It's a shout from the past, a direct visualization of the colorful, patterned textiles we have been searching for. The significance of the Ghurab Shroud cannot be overstated, because it acts as a crucial bridge between the two main types of evidence we have: the artistic depictions on tomb walls and the silent, beige linen fragments from the ground. For decades, Egyptologists debated how literal the tomb paintings were. Were the patterns on the clothing simply artistic conventions, a way for painters to fill space and add visual interest? The Ghurab Shroud answers that question with a resounding no. It proves that the patterns we see in art were not just painterly inventions. They were accurate representations of a real and widespread practice. The shroud itself looks exactly like a tomb painting that has somehow stepped off the wall and become a real object. The style of the figures, the choice of colors, the intricate details, they are all perfectly consistent with the art of the period. This tells us that we can trust the tomb paintings as a reliable archive. When we see a nobleman in a tomb wearing a kilt with a geometric border, we can now be confident that such a garment truly existed, and it likely looked very much like the painted version, possibly created using this very same technique of applying mineral pigments directly to the prepared linen. But the shroud also reveals the inherent fragility of this art form and helps explain why so few examples have survived. The pigments used are mineral-based red and yellow ochre, Egyptian blue, carbon black. Unlike organic dyes that penetrate the fiber, these pigments sit on the surface of the linen, bound by a gum or protein-based adhesive. This makes them incredibly vulnerable to flaking and abrasion. A garment painted in this way would have been delicate. It couldn't be roughly washed or worn for heavy labor. It was likely reserved for ceremonial use or, as in this case, for the final, sacred purpose of a burial shroud. The fact that the Girub shroud was found in a fragmentary state, having been torn and cut in antiquity, is a poignant reminder of its vulnerability. Its survival is nothing short of a miracle, dependent on a perfect, undisturbed tomb environment that protected it from moisture, physical pressure, and the destructive hands of robbers. For every one Girub shroud that survived, there were undoubtedly thousands of other painted textiles, ceremonial banners, temple hangings, festive clothing, that were used, enjoyed, and ultimately worn out or destroyed, leaving no trace behind. What makes the Girub shroud even more fascinating is the context of its discovery. It was found at a site associated with the royal harem, a place where the women of the king's court lived. This immediately adds a layer of social history to the object. The figures painted on the linen are not generic. They are specific depictions of these high-status women, perhaps even musicians and dancers from the palace itself. The shroud, therefore, becomes a powerful personal object. It may have been commissioned for one of these women, a final, beautiful garment that reflected her identity and her life of music, beauty, and ritual within the royal sphere. The patterns on the borders are not random. The repeating spirals and rosettes are symbols of fertility and eternal life, appropriate motifs for a funerary object. This transforms the shroud from a mere artifact into a biography. It tells a story about the person it wrapped, about their status, their aesthetic world, and their hopes for the afterlife. It connects us directly to an individual who lived and breathed over 3,000 years ago, who valued beauty so deeply that she was buried in a masterpiece of textile art. Ultimately, the Girub shroud serves as a definitive proof of concept. It confirms that the ancient Egyptian visual landscape was as colorful and patterned as their art suggests. It shows us that the technology for creating these brilliant effects was not limited to the loom. It also existed in the painter's workshop. This opens up a world of possibilities. If they were painting such intricate designs on burial shrouds, they were almost certainly doing the same on garments for the living. A festive tunic, a ceremonial robe, or a temple banner could all have been transformed with painted patterns, offering a more accessible and quicker way to achieve complex decoration than the painstaking process of tapestry weave. The shroud stands as a direct, fragile link to a whole category of art that has almost completely perished. It is a single, brilliant flash of lightning that, for a moment, illuminates the entire landscape, showing us the vivid colors and intricate patterns of a world we thought was lost, before the darkness of time closes in once more. This brings us to the very heart of the mystery, to the one place where the ancient Egyptians deliberately invested their most profound artistic efforts for eternity, the tomb. While we've explored the clothing of the living, it is in the realm of the dead that we find the most compelling evidence for textiles of unimaginable splendor. We must move beyond the common image of mummy bandages, those millions of yards of plain linen that served a vital functional role, and peer into a more sacred category, the special funerary textiles. These were not mere wrappings. They were ceremonial shrouds, ornate covers, and powerful votive cloths created for a single, ultimate purpose, to be seen by the gods. These textiles were the final, most important costume a soul would ever wear, and they were likely the most elaborately decorated of all, precisely because their audience was divine. Imagine the final preparation of a royal mummy. After the 70-day process of mummification, the body was pure and sanctified, ready for its journey. The wrapping in plain linen bandages was a meticulous, ritualized act in itself, but then came the final layers, the pieces meant for display in the sealed tomb. This is where the true textile masterpieces would have been employed. A magnificent shroud, perhaps as large as a sheet, would have been draped over the entire mummy bundle. Think of the Girub shroud, but on a royal scale and of even greater complexity. This shroud wasn't just a cover, it was a map of the afterlife. It might have been painted or tapestry woven with a perfect, detailed image of the deceased standing before Osiris, god of the underworld, being judge. It could have featured the 42 assessor gods of the Hall of Mot, or a massive, protective image of the sky goddess Nut, her star-covered body arching over the mummy, just as she was painted on the inside of coffin lids. Every symbol, every hieroglyph, every deity depicted on this cloth was a functional piece of magic, an active prayer woven or painted into the very fabric that would encase the body for eternity. Alongside these grand shrouds, there were smaller, incredibly potent votive cloths. These were not for wrapping the body, but for dedicating to specific gods within the tomb. A small, square linen cloth, exquisitely decorated, might be presented as an offering to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. Another might be dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of the West who welcomed the dead, its pattern featuring her sacred sistrum rattle or her face framed by cow horns. These textiles were the equivalent of sacred illuminated manuscripts, but made of cloth. Their decoration was not for human admiration. The tomb was sealed, never to be seen again by mortal eyes. The only viewers intended were the gods themselves. This explains why the Egyptians would have poured their ultimate resources and artistic skill into these objects. There was no higher stakes commission. A flaw in the pattern or a missing symbol could have cosmic consequences, potentially jeopardizing the soul's safe passage. This divine audience is the key reason we believe these funerary textiles represented the absolute pinnacle of the weaver's and painter's art, even if that art is now almost entirely lost to us. The potential complexity of these objects is staggering to consider. We can get a sense of it from surviving artifacts made in more durable materials. Look at the golden sarcophagus of Tutankhamun, covered from head to toe in intricate inlaid patterns that mimic cloisonné jewelry. What if these glittering gold and gemstone designs were actually representations of a textile shroud? It was common for Egyptian artisans to translate motifs from one medium to another. The beautiful, multi-colored beaded net dresses we discussed earlier are a perfect example of this, a textile concept rendered eternal in faience. It is therefore entirely plausible that the elaborate Rishi feather pattern seen on the coffins of some New Kingdom pharaohs, a design that looks like stylized wings wrapping the body, was first and foremost a design for a linen shroud. A shroud made of the finest white linen, with feathers painstakingly painted in shimmering blues, greens, and golds, would have created the illusion that the deceased was already transformed into a divine, winged being, a soul ready to take flight. The coffin then becomes a permanent, indestructible version of that original, perishable textile masterpiece. Furthermore, the tomb inventories and religious texts themselves hint at this hidden world of ceremonial cloth. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells designed to guide the soul, frequently mentions the importance of pure linen. Spell 125 specifically states that the deceased must be clean, dressed in fresh clothes, and shod in white sandals, to stand before Osiris. This fresh clothing almost certainly refers to these special funerary vestments, not the underlayers of bandages. Some spells even instruct that specific chapters be written on a new piece of linen and placed under the head of the mummy. While most of these Book of the Dead papyri that survive are on papyrus scrolls, the instruction to use linen suggests that for the most elite burials, these crucial spells may have been rendered on custom-woven or painted textiles of breathtaking quality. Imagine a long, narrow linen banner, hung in the burial chamber, its entire surface covered with hieroglyphs and vignettes from the Book of the Dead, each character drawn with a scribe's precision but on a painter's canvas of cloth. The survival of such an object would rewrite our understanding of Egyptian funerary art, but its organic nature makes it the least likely treasure to find. This concept of textiles as a direct interface with the divine finds its ultimate expression in the rituals performed in temples, which then influenced what was placed in the tomb. In major state temples, the cult statue of the god was treated as a living entity. Several times a day, priests would perform the ritual of the four baths, which involved dressing the statue in different types of linen for different hours. There were specific, sacred vestments for the deity. While these temple textiles have all perished, their existence is well documented. It stands to reason that a pharaoh, who became a god upon his death, would be provided with a similar set of divine vestments for his own eternal cult. His tomb would have contained its own wardrobe of godly attire: a shroud for the night, another for the day, a ceremonial kilt for appearing in the solar bark, and a pleated robe for receiving offerings. Each of these would have been decorated with symbols specific to its purpose, woven with gold thread, and dyed with colors forbidden to anyone else. These were not clothes of the living world, but garments for a deified existence, designed to be recognized and honored by the other gods in the afterlife. Their creation would have been a state secret, their patterns known only to the highest priests and the most trusted master weavers. This sacred secrecy, combined with their deliberate placement in the sealed, hidden tomb, means that the most important textiles in all of Egyptian culture are the very ones we are guaranteed never to see, their glorious patterns known only to the gods for whom they were truly made. But how do we move beyond these ghostly traces and educated guesses? How do we truly bring these silent patterns back from the brink of oblivion? The answer lies in a fascinating and deeply creative field known as experimental archaeology, where modern scholars and master weavers are essentially learning to speak the lost language of Egyptian textiles, not by reading about it, but by doing it. This isn't just academic study, it's a form of time travel, a hands-on process of reverse engineering history. These researchers begin with the same evidence we've been exploring: the tomb paintings, the rare surviving fragments, the chemical analysis of faded dyes, and the depictions of looms on tomb walls. They then take the radical step of attempting to recreate these ancient textiles from the ground up, using historically accurate materials and techniques. It's a process fraught with trial and error, but every successful reproduction is a powerful argument, a tangible hypothesis about what once was. When a modern weaver, using a reconstructed horizontal ground loom and hand-spun flax thread, successfully creates a piece of cloth that matches the drape and texture of an ancient sample, they haven't just made a replica, they have validated a theory about ancient technology. They feel the physical challenges the original weaver faced: the strain on the back, the difficulty of keeping an even tension, the immense time required to produce even a small amount of fabric. This physical empathy with the past is something a textbook can never provide. The process often starts with the most fundamental element, the thread itself. Modern, machine-spun linen thread is too uniform and smooth. To achieve an authentic look and feel, experimental archaeologists often begin by growing their own flax, harvesting it at the correct time of year, and then processing it using ancient methods. This involves retting, a process of soaking the stalks in water to break down the pith, then breaking, scutching, and hackling the fibers to separate the valuable linen from the woody core. Only then can they begin to spin the thread using a drop spindle, a simple weighted tool that was the primary spinning method for millennia. This alone is a skill that takes months to master, and it immediately reveals why fine linen was so valuable. Producing a consistent, gossamer thin thread by hand is an art form in itself. Once they have their authentic thread, the weavers move to the loom. Many research projects involve building a full-scale reproduction of an Egyptian horizontal ground loom, pegging the beams into the ground, and setting up the warp threads exactly as depicted in tomb scenes. This is where the true constraints of the technology become starkly clear. Attempting to weave a complex pattern on this loom with its fixed warp is, as one modern practitioner described, a lesson in humility. It requires an assistant and an almost superhuman level of patience, vividly demonstrating why certain types of patterns were common and others were likely reserved for only the most elite commissions. One of the most spectacular outcomes of this experimental work has been the revival of ancient Egyptian dyeing techniques. Armed with the chemical analysis from sites like Amarna and Tutankhamun's tomb, dyers are now going out into the fields to harvest the same plants the Egyptians used. They gather madder root, patiently dry and crush it to extract its red alizarin. They collect safflower petals, going through the meticulous process of washing out the yellow to access the prized red dye. They experiment with different mordants like alum and fermented urine to see how they affect the color fastness and hue. The results are often stunning. A simple skein of hand-spun linen, when dipped into a vat of freshly made madder dye, emerges not as a faint pinkish ghost, but as a deep, vibrant, brick red, the exact color that would have adorned a pharaoh's ceremonial sash. Seeing these colors reborn on authentic materials is a revelation. It shatters the beige and sand aesthetic we associate with ancient Egypt and replaces it with something far more lively and human. These aren't the muted tones of a faded past. They are the bold, confident colors of a people who lived in a bright and colorful world. The ultimate goal, of course, is to bring the patterns themselves back to life. Textile artists meticulously study the repeating geometric borders on tomb paintings, counting the motifs and analyzing the symmetry. They then translate these designs into weave patterns, often discovering that what looks simple in a painting is incredibly complex to execute on a loom. A project might focus on recreating the elaborate, pleated linen of a royal kilt. How did they achieve those razor-sharp, permanent pleats? Experiments have shown that soaking the linen in a gum-based solution and then pressing it while damp, perhaps with heavy, heated stones, could set the pleats for a long time. Another project might attempt to recreate a beaded net dress, not in faience, but in the way it was likely worn in life, by hand stringing thousands of tiny faience or stone beads onto a linen thread, and then netting them together over a linen underdress. The final product is a heavy, shimmering garment that moves with a soft, musical clatter, completely transforming our understanding of what Egyptian fashion sounded and felt like. These recreations are more than just museum displays, they are functional tests. By wearing the clothing, moving in it, and understanding its weight and drape, researchers gain insights into the physical experience of daily life and ritual that are completely absent from the static archaeological record. These modern efforts do more than just satisfy our curiosity. They actively reshape our interpretation of the past. Every successful recreation forces Egyptologists to reconsider long-held assumptions. A pattern that was thought to be purely symbolic, painted by an artist for magical purposes, suddenly becomes a viable, weavable design when a modern craftsperson demonstrates it can be done with the tools of the time. This back and forth between the scholar's analysis and the artisan's skill creates a powerful feedback loop. The archaeologist provides the blueprint from the tombs and fragments, and the weaver tests its feasibility, often revealing hidden complexities or offering new, more plausible explanations for how a certain textile was made. This collaboration is breathing life back into a field that was once dominated by silent, static objects. The lost textile patterns of ancient Egypt are no longer just abstract concepts or faded stains. Through the dedication of these modern detectives, they are becoming living, breathing, tangible art once again, allowing us to finally see, and even touch, a world we thought was gone forever. This brings us to a fundamental and paradoxical force that has shaped our entire understanding of ancient Egyptian textiles, the very environment of Egypt itself. We often think of the land of the pharaohs as a perpetually dry desert, a natural museum where everything is preserved forever. But the reality is far more complex and nuanced. Egypt's climate has acted as a capricious and unpredictable curator, a great eraser that has meticulously preserved some treasures while systematically wiping others from existence, creating the frustratingly incomplete puzzle we are trying to solve today. The legendary preservation we associate with Egypt is real, but its power is geographically specific. It is the gift of the absolute desert, the areas far from the life-giving Nile. In these hyper-arid regions, where annual rainfall can be virtually zero, the conditions are perfect for halting decay. Bacteria and fungi, the primary agents of organic decay, require moisture to live and function. In the bone-dry air of the desert, these microorganisms go dormant or die. Without them, organic materials like wood, leather, food, and crucially, linen, can lie untouched for millennia. The sand acts as a perfect desiccant, sucking every last molecule of water out of an object and then protecting it from the elements. This is why we have the stunning finds from desert cemeteries, the intact tombs, the wooden statues, the baskets of fruit, and yes, the plain linen mummy wrappings. These objects were essentially freeze-dried by nature the moment they were sealed away. Their molecular clocks stopped for thousands of years. This is the climate as a perfect preserver, and it is the reason we have any ancient textiles at all. But this ideal scenario is only one half of the story, and it applies to a minority of archaeological contexts. The vast majority of ancient Egyptians did not live and die in the deep desert. They lived in the Nile Valley. Their homes, their workshops, and their daily lives were centered on the river, in an environment that was, and still is, one of dramatic fluctuation. The Nile Valley is a ribbon of life, a strip of incredibly fertile land surrounded by desert. This creates a world of two extremes. For most of the year, the climate is arid. But the river itself brings constant moisture to the soil, creating a high water table. There is also the annual inundation, the great flood that would cover the valley each summer, depositing rich silt but also saturating the ground. In this environment, the conditions for preservation are far from perfect. Organic materials buried in the damp soil of the valley are subjected to a slow, relentless cycle of decay. They are exposed to moisture, to shifting water tables, to plant roots, and to the very bacteria that the desert excludes. A linen tunic discarded in a village midden, or a colorful wool cloak stored in a chest in a mud brick house, would have had a very short lifespan. In the valley, the climate is not a preserver, it is a destroyer. This geographical split creates what archaeologists call a preservation bias. Our view of ancient Egyptian life is overwhelmingly skewed toward the funerary world of the desert cemeteries. We know an incredible amount about how they died and what they believed about the afterlife because those materials were placed in the perfect environment for survival. But we know comparatively very little about the vibrant, messy, colorful world of their daily lives in the towns and cities, because those organic materials have almost entirely vanished. Think of the difference between a royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings and a commoner's house in the city of Thebes. The tomb, carved into the dry limestone of the desert hills, preserves its contents for millennia. The house, built on the damp soil of the valley floor, would see its wooden furniture rot, its food supplies decay, and any textiles left behind turn to dust within a few generations. This means the textiles we have are almost exclusively funeral in nature: the mummy wrappings, the burial tunics, the vibrant daily fashions, the patterned wall hangings, the colorful awnings, the practical woolen blankets. All the textiles that made a house a home have been almost completely erased by the very environment that sustained the civilization. The process of decay itself is a fascinating and destructive chemical ballet. For a colorful textile, there is a double assassination at work. First, the linen fibers themselves, which are made of cellulose, are attacked. In a damp environment, cellulolytic bacteria and fungi break down the long cellulose chains, weakening the fabric until it simply disintegrates into a pile of brown, unidentifiable dust. This process is accelerated by the presence of other organic materials. A textile buried in a trash pit with food waste will decay much faster than one in a clean, sandy grave. But even if the linen itself manages to survive in a fragile, brittle state, the second assassination is often complete: the destruction of the color. As we've discussed, most dyes were organic. In a moist environment, the fading process is dramatically accelerated. The molecules are broken down not just by light, but by water and biological activity. A beautiful red from madder root, buried in the damp soil, might last only a few decades before fading to a faint pink stain, and then to nothing at all. A textile that spent its life in the humid air of a Nile side home, being occasionally washed and worn, never stood a chance of surviving for millennia. Its beauty was always meant to be temporary. Perhaps the most heartbreaking examples of this selective erasure come from the royal capitals themselves. Consider the city of Amarna, built by the pharaoh Akhenaten on a virgin site on the east bank of the Nile. It was a magnificent, sprawling city, occupied for only about 15 years before being abandoned. This gives archaeologists a perfect, frozen snapshot of a single period. Excavations there have revealed beautiful wall paintings and sculptures, but the organic finds are sparse. In the houses of high officials, impressions in the mudbrick floors sometimes show where wooden chests once stood. Inside these ghostly outlines, archaeologists might find a few corroded metal fittings from the chest, and perhaps a faint, dark stain in the soil, the carbonized remains of the wood and any textiles that were inside. All that is left of what was likely a wardrobe of beautifully patterned clothing is a shapeless, blackened smear in the dirt. The city was not in the deep desert. It was on the edge of the cultivation, subject to the same destructive humidity as every other Nile Valley settlement. The climate preserved the stone and the pottery, but it systematically erased the wood, the food, and the vast, vibrant world of textiles that would have filled the city with color and life. This great erasure even extends to the tombs themselves, but in a more subtle way. The stability of a tomb is not guaranteed. A crack in the ceiling, a rare but powerful rainstorm, or even the slow, capillary rise of groundwater through the bedrock can introduce moisture into a sealed chamber that has been dry for centuries. When this happens, the results are catastrophic. A tomb that was once a time capsule becomes a compost heap. Linen bandages, which could have survived for 3,000 years in perfect condition, can turn to a black, gooey mass in just a few decades of dampness. Wooden coffins swell and warp, and any painted or dyed textiles are the first to suffer, their colors bleeding away and their fibers dissolving. This is why the discovery of a completely intact, dry tomb is so exceptionally rare. For every Tutankhamun, there are thousands of tombs that were breached in antiquity, either by robbers or by nature, allowing the destructive power of moisture to finish the job that time had started. The climate giveth, and the climate taketh away, often in the very same location, leaving behind a patchwork of preservation and loss that makes the archaeologist's task one of eternal frustration and wonder. So we have the fragile threads themselves, the paintings on tomb walls, and the brilliant recreations of modern weavers. But there is another, even more ghostly category of evidence, one that requires us to look not at the textiles, but at what they left behind. Sometimes the most enduring record of something fragile is not the object itself, but its impression on something far more durable. This is the world of telltale imprints, where the very absence of the cloth screams its former presence. The most common and revealing of these ghostly echoes are found on pottery. Imagine an ancient Egyptian potter working at their wheel. They've just finished forming a beautiful vessel, and its surface is still soft, wet clay. To handle it, to move it to a drying area, they might wrap a piece of cloth around their hands to get a better grip, or they might set the pot down on a woven mat to keep it clean. In that moment, when the clay is at its most impressionable, the texture of that fabric, the warp and weft of a simple linen towel, the intricate diamond pattern of a basket, or the coarse weave of a sack, is pressed directly into the surface of the pot. The potters certainly didn't intend to create a permanent archaeological record. They were just doing their job. But then, the pot was fired in a kiln. The heat hardened the clay, baking that fleeting textile impression into the ceramic forever. The cloth itself, the towel or the mat, wore out, was discarded, and turned to dust thousands of years ago. But the pot, or more often, a broken fragment of that pot known as a potsherd, survived, and on its surface is a perfect, negative image of a textile pattern that has otherwise completely vanished from the earth. These impressions are like fingerprints left at a scene. Archaeologists can study them under a microscope and learn astonishing details. They can count the number of threads per centimeter, revealing the fineness of the weave. They can see the spin of the thread, whether it was twisted to the left or the right, which can sometimes indicate the gender of the spinner, as some studies suggest men and women had different spinning traditions. They can identify the type of weave, whether it was a simple plain weave or something more complex like a basket weave. On a few remarkable sherds, impressions of what appear to be decorative selvages, the finished edges of a piece of cloth, have been found, showing that even everyday textiles could have small, deliberate decorative elements. This evidence is crucial because it comes not from the tomb, but from the settlement. These are the textiles of daily life, the ones used in homes and workshops, the very ones that are so rarely preserved. A potsherd with a textile impression from a village dump is a direct window into the material world of an ordinary Egyptian, telling us that the coarseness or fineness of the cloth we find in tombs was not just for show, but reflected a real hierarchy of quality that existed at all levels of society. But the magic of these imprints doesn't stop with clay. An even more dramatic form of preservation occurs through a process known as mineral replacement, and it frequently involves metal, particularly copper and bronze. The Egyptians were master metalworkers, creating everything from intricate mirrors and razors to sturdy tools and weapons. Often, these objects were stored in boxes or wrapped in cloth for protection. If the conditions are just right specifically, if the burial environment is damp enough for the metal to corrode, but not so wet as to destroy everything, a remarkable transformation can take place. As the copper object corrodes, it releases ions that interact with the fibers of the surrounding linen. Over centuries, the linen slowly decays, but as it does so, the corrosion products from the metal, often a green malachite or a blue azurite, create a perfect, mineralized cast of the fabric. It's as if the metal grows a new skin, a skin that holds the shape and texture of the cloth that once touched it. The organic linen vanishes, but its ghost remains, frozen in stone. Some of the most stunning examples of this come from tools discovered in the workers' village at Deir el-Medina. A copper chisel, buried for millennia, might be found encased in a lump of green corrosion. But when conservators carefully remove that corrosion under a microscope, they don't just find a ruined tool. They find that the corrosion has preserved the intricate weave of the rag it was wrapped in. In one famous case, the texture of the fabric was so perfectly preserved that conservators could even see where a thread had broken and been clumsily repaired. A tiny, intimate detail of daily life from a worker who lived over 3,000 years ago. This isn't just a pattern, it's a story. It tells of thrift, of making do, of a tool that was valued enough to be carefully stored, wrapped in a cloth that was valued enough to be mended. Even more dramatic are the finds from some burials, where copper mirrors have been discovered with the entire outline of their linen pouch preserved as a green, crystalline stain on the metal surface. You can see the shape of the bag, the seam where it was stitched together, and the delicate weave of the fabric itself. The mirror's reflective surface may be long gone, clouded and corroded, but the ghost of its cloth covering remains, a beautiful and poignant silhouette of a vanished object. Perhaps the most emotionally resonant of these imprints are those found not on tools, but on personal items. There are instances where a copper vase or an alabaster jar, placed as a grave good, was sealed with a cloth lid tied on with a string. Over time, the cloth decayed, but the corrosive salts from the vessel interacted with the fabric, preserving the impression of both the cloth and the knot that tied it shut. To an archaeologist, that preserved knot is a moment frozen in time. It's the last hand that touched that object before it was sealed in the tomb for eternity. The type of knot, the thickness of the cord, the weave of the fabric, all of it becomes a data point, a silent testament to a final, ritual act. These impressions provide a different kind of evidence than a painting or a surviving fragment. They are accidental, unconscious records. They carry no artistic license, no symbolic agenda. They are simply the physical truth of what was there, a truth pressed into clay or cast in metal, waiting in the dust for us to find, offering us a whisper of the countless textiles that clothed, covered, and accompanied the ancient Egyptians through every moment of their lives, from the most mundane task to the final journey to the afterlife. Now, let's journey to one of the most turbulent and artistically radical periods in all of Egyptian history, the Amarna period. Under the rule of the pharaoh Akhenaten, Egyptian society was turned upside down. He abandoned the traditional pantheon of gods, shutting down the temples of Ammon and elevating a single, abstract deity, the Aten, or the sun disk. This religious revolution was accompanied by a stunning and immediate artistic revolution. The rigid, formal, and idealized art of previous dynasties was cast aside almost overnight. In its place came a startlingly naturalistic style. In the carvings and paintings from his new capital city of Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, we see the royal family depicted with elongated faces, heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, slender necks, and rounded, almost soft bodies. They are shown in intimate, familial scenes kissing, playing with their children, eating behaviors never before depicted in formal Egyptian art. This was a conscious, top-down reinvention of visual culture, intended to reflect the new theological focus on the life-giving, tangible rays of the sun. If art was transformed so fundamentally in stone and paint, is it not logical, even inevitable, that the same revolutionary spirit would have extended to the very cloth they wore? This leads us to a tantalizing possibility, that Akhenaten's reign saw a parallel revolution in textile design, a brief, brilliant flash of new patterns and aesthetics that were systematically erased from history after his death. Imagine the visual landscape of the new capital. Gone were the dark, imposing temples of the old gods. In their place, open-air courtyards were built to bathe in the direct light of the Aten. The art on the walls was fluid, dynamic, and filled with motion. It seems almost unthinkable that the fashions moving through these sun-drenched spaces would have remained static, clinging to the old, formal patterns of the past. The art of the period gives us our first major clue. Look at the famous carved relief of Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, making offerings. Their garments are depicted with an unprecedented attention to the flow and drape of the fabric. The linen clings to their bodies, revealing the forms beneath in a way that was previously taboo. But more than just the cut, the artists took great care to show texture. The hems of royal garments are often shown with intricate, detailed fringes. The shawls and sashes appear to be covered in patterns that are less rigidly geometric and more organic. We see what appear to be delicate, woven or embroidered motifs that echo the natural world so central to Atenist worship: fluttering leaves, blooming flowers, and perhaps even the tiny, ankh-shaped rays of the sun that terminate in hands, reaching down to touch the royal family. This was an art obsessed with the immediacy of life and nature, so it follows that the textiles would have mirrored this, moving away from the symbolic, formalized patterns of falcons and lotus blossoms and toward a new vocabulary of vines, petals, and sunbeams. The driving force behind this potential textile revolution would have been the royal family itself, particularly the powerful women of the court. Nefertiti and her daughters are depicted with a frequency and prominence never seen before. They are central actors in the new religious cult. It is highly probable that they used fashion as a tool to promote the new ideology. A gown worn by Nefertiti during a public appearance at the Window of Appearances would not have been a simple garment. It was a piece of state propaganda. What if that gown was made of a new, lighter, more fluid linen, woven with a revolutionary new technique that allowed for curvilinear, flowing patterns? What if it was dyed in colors that symbolized the Aten brilliant golds, warm yellows, and stark whites, replacing the traditional reds and blues associated with Ammon and other old gods? The royal workshops at Amarna would have been hubs of intense innovation, with weavers and dyers pushed to create entirely new designs that pleased the king and reflected his singular vision of the world. These artisans would have been experimenting with new dye sources from the expanded empire, new weaving techniques on improved vertical looms, and new patterns drawn directly from the lush gardens of the royal palace, all under the direct patronage of a court that valued artistic novelty above all else. This speculation, however, leads us directly to the core of the mystery and the reason this Amarna fashion revolution is, for us, a ghost. When Akhenaten died, his entire religious and political project collapsed with breathtaking speed. His name was chiseled out of monuments, his city was abandoned, and the traditional priesthood of Ammon was restored to power with a vengeance. This was more than a political restoration, it was a cultural purge. The state actively sought to erase Akhenaten and his memory from history. His statues were torn down, his temples dismantled for building stone, and his city was left to the desert winds. In this fervent campaign of damnatio memoriae, the most ephemeral art forms would have been the easiest and most complete targets. While a stone statue is heavy and difficult to destroy entirely, a bolt of cloth can be burned, unraveled, or simply left to rot. The vibrant, Aten-specific textiles of the Amarna court would have been politically dangerous to own. For the elite who survived the transition, holding onto a robe decorated with sun rays and ankhs would have been like keeping a portrait of a deposed dictator in your closet. It was an invitation for persecution. Consequently, the most likely fate of these revolutionary textiles was systematic destruction. They were probably gathered up from the palace storerooms and burned in great bonfires. Garments that had been gifted to loyal officials were surely discarded, or, if the fabric was valuable enough, painstakingly unpicked and rewoven into a plain, politically safe cloth. This recycling of valuable linen would have been a common practice, effectively bleaching the artistic rebellion out of the material record. This purging, combined with the simple fact that Amarna was a city occupied for only about 15 years, means the window for these textiles to enter the archaeological record was incredibly narrow. Unlike Thebes or Memphis, which were occupied for millennia, Amarna was a fleeting moment. The number of tombs from this period is small, and many were looted or defaced in antiquity. The chance of a sealed, intact Amarna-era burial preserving a pristine example of this radical fashion is almost zero. The very conditions that make Amarna such a fascinating, self-contained laboratory for archaeologists also ensure that its most perishable treasures are the ones we are least likely to find. So, the evidence for an Amarna textile revolution remains circumstantial, built on a powerful and logical inference. We have the radical change in all other art forms. We have the ideological need for a new visual language. We have the prominence of fashion as a tool of royal propaganda. And we have the historical context of a violent counter-revolution that would have sought to eliminate every last trace of the old regime. All these threads point toward the existence of a lost chapter in the history of Egyptian textiles. The patterns of Akhenaten's court were likely as revolutionary as his religion, softer, more naturalistic, and intimately tied to the cult of the sun. They represented a path not taken, a potential evolution of Egyptian aesthetics that was cut short and deliberately scrubbed from existence. When we look at the art from the tombs of the officials who served him, we are likely seeing stylized representations of these very real, but now vanished, fabrics. The flowing lines on the clothing in these reliefs may be the last, ghostly echoes of a fashion revolution that flickered brilliantly for a single generation, only to be extinguished so completely that today, we can only reconstruct it through deduction and imagination, a beautiful and haunting what if in the long history of Egyptian art. When we shift our focus from the grand world of pharaohs and priests to the smaller, more intimate sphere of children, the silence in the archaeological record becomes almost deafening. The evidence for what an ancient Egyptian child wore is incredibly scant, creating a profound gap in our understanding of daily life. This isn't just a missing detail. It's the erasure of an entire dimension of childhood. In a culture that so meticulously prepared for the afterlife, the relative absence of children's garments from tombs is both telling and tragic. Child mortality was heartbreakingly high, and while we do find the burials of infants and children, they are often far more modest than those of adults, containing fewer grave goods and, crucially, fewer preserved textiles. The tiny tunics and wraps that did exist were likely passed down to younger siblings, worn out through play, or were simply made from fabrics too fragile to survive. What we are left with are faint echoes and logical deductions, forcing us to become detectives searching for the ghosts of the smallest Egyptians. The primary visual evidence, as with so much of this mystery, comes from tomb paintings and reliefs. Here, children are often depicted, but they are usually shown as miniature adults, scaled-down versions of their parents wearing the same simple linen kilts or sheath dresses. This artistic convention can be misleading. It suggests a uniformity that likely didn't exist in reality. However, if we look closer, there are subtle clues. In some scenes, very young children, both boys and girls, are shown completely naked. This wasn't considered indecent. It was a practical reflection of the hot climate and the freedom of early childhood. As they grew older, they would graduate to clothing, but it's in the small, personal objects that we find the most compelling hints of a distinct child's world. For instance, small, child-sized sandals have been discovered, some even showing signs of wear, telling a silent story of tiny feet at play. More poignantly, artifacts like a small wooden toy horse or a carefully carved doll, often found in domestic settings, give us a sense of their world, but the doll's own miniature clothing has almost always been lost to time. This leads to a fascinating and emotionally resonant question. If children's clothing did exist, was it merely functional, or was it imbued with the same symbolic thinking that governed so much of Egyptian life? It is difficult to believe that a culture so obsessed with magic, protection, and symbolism would leave their most vulnerable members without some form of spiritual armor woven directly into their garments. While we have no surviving examples of a child's tunic covered in protective patterns, we can look to other evidence for their well-being. Amulets were a fundamental part of life. Children were frequently buried with small necklaces or bracelets featuring protective deities like Bes, the dwarf god who guarded the household and specifically protected women and children, or Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. These amulets weren't just for the afterlife, they were worn in life. It is a very small logical leap to suggest that these same protective symbols, the fierce face of Bes or the powerful form of Teret, could have been embroidered as simple patterns onto a child's linen tunic, or woven into the band of a little kilt. A mother might stitch a tiny Sa symbol, representing protection, onto the hem of her baby's wrap, a magical safeguard that was washed and worn until it faded away. Beyond protection, there is the potent concept of play and the expression of parental love. The Egyptians clearly cherished their children. Letters and texts speak of the joy they brought, and tomb scenes show parents embracing their sons and daughters with clear affection. In a society that valued beauty and display, wouldn't this affection have extended to adorning a child? While the elite might have had access to fine linen for their infants, even a farming family might have found a way to add a touch of color or pattern to a child's garment for a festival or a birthday. This might not have been the elaborate tapestry of a king's robe, but something far simpler and more heartfelt. A stripe of naturally dyed yarn woven into a plain tunic, a few beads sewn onto a collar, or even a pattern painted on with ochre clay could have transformed a simple piece of cloth into something special. Think of the universal human impulse to dress a child in something cheerful. It seems almost against human nature to imagine that an Egyptian parent, seeing a bolt of cloth with a simple, colorful pattern, wouldn't have thought, "My son would look wonderful in that," or "This bright design would make my daughter smile." These moments of tender, domestic artistry are the most ephemeral of all. They were created for the moment, for the smile of a child, not for eternity in a tomb, and so they have vanished without a trace, leaving us with only the quiet certainty that they must have existed. But our exploration of these lost patterns would be incomplete if we only considered what was woven into the fabric or painted upon its surface. There is another, even more delicate art form that almost certainly flourished in ancient Egypt, yet has left behind almost no physical evidence: the art of embroidery. Unlike a woven pattern, which is an integral part of the cloth's structure, embroidery is applied on top, a decorative layer of stitching that can create incredibly fine, free-flowing designs. This very characteristic, its status as a surface addition, is what makes it so vulnerable. The embroidery thread, often as delicate as the ground fabric it adorns, decays at the same rate, leaving behind nothing but the faintest of clues and forcing us to become textual detectives, searching for its ghost in the art and artifacts that remain. To build the case for Egyptian embroidery, we must first turn our gaze back to the tomb paintings, but this time with a specific question in mind. Look closely at the garments worn by the highest elites in New Kingdom tombs. You will often see clothing decorated with small, intricate, self-contained motifs. These aren't the large, repeating geometric borders that could be more easily woven on a loom. Instead, we see isolated symbols: a single ankh, a tiny falcon with outstretched wings, or a delicate lotus blossom placed precisely on a shoulder strap, the center of a chest, or the hem of a gown. The key detail is how these motifs are rendered. They often have a distinct, raised appearance, a subtle texture that sets them apart from the flat surface of the garment. They look less like a pattern woven into the fabric and more like something that has been meticulously stitched on top of it. This is precisely the effect that skilled embroidery creates, adding not just color but also a tactile, three-dimensional quality to the cloth. When an artist took the time to depict this raised, textured effect, they were likely recording a real and luxurious technique, one that allowed for a level of personalized, symbolic decoration that was impossible to achieve with the loom alone. The argument strengthens considerably when we look beyond Egypt's borders. The ancient Egyptians were not an isolated people. They were active participants in a vibrant Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, and they were keen observers and adopters of foreign luxury goods and techniques. We have solid archaeological evidence that their contemporaries were master embroiderers. The civilizations of Mesopotamia, for instance, left behind written records boasting of elaborate garments embroidered with gold and silver thread. In the famous royal tombs of Ur, dating back to 2500 BCE, impressions in the soil revealed that the deceased were buried in cloaks, covered in elaborate, embroidered designs made from thin sheets of gold and silver cut into strips and stitched onto the fabric. While the cloth itself had vanished, the metal threads survived, pressed into the earth, outlining stunning patterns of animals and geometric shapes. Similarly, the Mycenaeans in Greece were known for their elaborate textiles, and their linear B tablets record the allocation of materials for decorated cloth that almost certainly involved embroidery. Given the extensive trade and diplomatic contact between Egypt and these cultures, it is nearly inconceivable that the Egyptian elite, always eager to display their wealth and cosmopolitan connections, would not have coveted and commissioned such exquisitely detailed work for themselves. This line of reasoning leads us to a compelling, albeit indirect, form of evidence: the existence of the necessary tools and materials. Embroidery requires very few specialized items, a fine needle and strong, colorful thread. The ancient Egyptians had both in abundance. They were master metalworkers, producing incredibly fine bronze and copper needles, some so slender they rival modern sewing needles. These have been found in domestic contexts and in the toolkits of workers, like those at Deir el-Medina. They also possessed the threads. While most embroidery was likely done with the same linen thread used for weaving, the real luxury would have come from the use of dyed threads in vibrant madder red, safflower yellow, or woad blue, all of which we know they mastered. Even more opulent would be the use of metallic threads. The Egyptians were prolific users of gold foil and wire in their jewelry and funerary masks. The technological leap from hammering gold into foil for a collar to cutting that same foil into thin strips and twisting it around a linen core to create a pliable, sewable gold thread is a very small one. A royal tunic with a falcon embroidered in gleaming gold thread across the chest is exactly the kind of spectacular, one-of-a-kind garment that would have proclaimed a pharaoh's divine and earthly power. A wearable masterpiece that was simply too valuable to be placed in a tomb and risk falling into the hands of robbers. Perhaps the most haunting evidence for this lost art comes from the rare and precious instances where the embroidery itself hasn't survived, but its negative impression has. We discussed how textile impressions can be preserved in pottery or metal corrosion, and this applies to embroidery as well. In a few exceptional cases, the corrosion products from a bronze or copper object have preserved not just the weave of the surrounding linen, but the distinct, raised pattern of decorative stitching that was on that linen. The metal, as it slowly decayed, effectively created a perfect mold of the embroidered motif. While these finds are incredibly rare, they serve as a smoking gun, proving that the technique of applying decorative stitching to fabric was known and practiced. They confirm that what we are seeing in the paintings was not just an artist's imagination, but a reflection of a real, tangible art form. The very fact that such evidence is so scarce only underscores how exceptionally fragile this art was. Its survival relies on a perfect and unlikely alignment of object, material, and chemical condition. When we consider the Egyptian worldview, the existence of embroidery makes profound symbolic sense. This was a culture that believed in the power of hieroglyphs and symbols to manifest reality. To have a protective symbol like the wedge at eye or the Sa sign of protection not just painted on a garment, but physically stitched into it, would have imbued that clothing with a more potent, permanent magic. The act of embroidering, of carefully pulling each thread to form a sacred shape, was itself a kind of ritual, a way of weaving a prayer or a protective spell directly into the fabric that would touch the skin. This transforms a garment from a simple covering into an amulet, a functional piece of spiritual armor. A child's tunic with a tiny bes figure embroidered on the shoulder, or a priest's vestment with the name of a god stitched in hieroglyphs around the hem, would have been far more than fashionable. They were active participants in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, their very threads charged with intention and divine power. This conceptual layer gives us the final, compelling reason to believe in the lost art of Egyptian embroidery. It fits perfectly within their cultural framework, satisfying both an aesthetic desire for personalized luxury and a deep, spiritual need for protection, creating a legacy of beauty and meaning that, like the finest silk thread, has frayed away into the silent tapestry of time. But to truly understand the soul of these lost patterns, we must look beyond the physical loom and the dye vat, and into the very cosmos as the ancient Egyptians perceived it. For them, the act of weaving was not merely a craft, it was a divine act of creation, a terrestrial echo of the god's work. This profound connection is most beautifully expressed in the concept of the woven sky. Imagine gazing up at the Egyptian night, a vast, black expanse pierced by countless, shimmering stars. The Egyptians did not see random points of light. They saw a magnificent, celestial tapestry. They envisioned the sky as a great goddess, Nut, her star-studded body arched over the earth, but the medium of her divine form was often described as woven cloth. The stars were not just on the sky, they were the intricate patterns woven into its fabric. This was not a vague metaphor, but a core tenet of their cosmology. The night sky was a literal, heavenly textile, a protective blanket stitched with light, draped over the world by the hands of the gods. This belief transforms every thread spun on earth into a potential connection to the cosmos, and every pattern woven into linen into a reflection of that starry, divine blueprint. Overseeing this sacred intersection of the cosmic and the earthly was a goddess whose very essence was the thread that bound them together, Teat. While she may not be as famous as Isis or Osiris, Teat held a role of immense practical and spiritual importance as the patron deity of weaving. She was the divine weaver, the celestial mistress of the loom. Her name itself is thought to be connected to the word for cloth or linen, rooting her identity directly in the material. But her power went far beyond simple patronage of a craft. Teat was believed to imbue the linen she oversaw with magical, protective properties. The cloth produced under her divine influence wasn't just fabric, it was a substance charged with Heka, the fundamental force of magic. This is why the highest quality linen, the kind used to wrap a mummy or clothe a statue of a god, was so revered. It wasn't just its fineness or whiteness that made it sacred. It was the belief that Teat's divine essence was woven into its very fibers, turning a simple bolt of cloth into a shield against chaos and a conduit for divine favor. This cosmic and divine context forces us to reimagine the very purpose of a patterned textile within a temple or a tomb. If a simple white linen could be sacred due to Teat's influence, then a cloth bearing a specific, intricate pattern must have been exponentially more potent. Let's consider what these sacred patterned cloths might have depicted. It's highly probable that temple workshops, operating under the guidance of the highest priests, produced special vestments and hangings for ritual use. These wouldn't have featured random decorations. Their patterns would have been a direct translation of religious texts and cosmic diagrams into the language of thread. One can envision a vast temple hanging, a backdrop for the most secret rites, depicting the solar bark of Ra as it journeyed through the 12 hours of the night. This wouldn't be a mere picture. It would be a magical map, its woven path intended to guide and protect the sun god on his perilous journey through the underworld, ensuring he would be reborn at dawn. The act of weaving such a scene was, in effect, an act of sympathetic magic, a ritual performed by the weavers to maintain the cosmic order itself. The symbolism could be even more direct and powerful. Another likely candidate for a sacred pattern is the iconic image of the goddess Nut, the personification of the woven sky herself. A ceremonial shroud placed over a sacred statue or used in a king's burial might have featured a beautifully rendered tapestry of Nut, her body blue and covered in 5-pointed stars, her arms and legs reaching to the 4 cardinal directions. To envelop a king or a god in this pattern was to literally wrap them in the cosmos, to place them under the direct, protective embrace of the sky goddess for all eternity. Similarly, the Jed pillar, the symbol of stability and the backbone of Osiris, would have been a powerful motif to weave into the foundation of a temple's ritual curtains. Every time the curtains were drawn open, the woven Jed would be revealed, magically reinforcing the stability of the temple, a microcosm of the stable universe against the forces of disorder that sought to overwhelm it. The ultimate expression of this sacred weaving may have been reserved for the gods themselves. Inside the darkest, most sacred chamber of a temple, the cult statue of a deity like Amun-Ra or Ptah would have been more than a stone idol. It was a vessel for the god's spirit. And like a living entity, it was clothed, adorned, and cared for. The textiles made for these divine statues represent the absolute pinnacle of the weaver's art, pieces so holy and secret that they were likely never seen by the public. These divine vestments would have been woven on looms consecrated to Teat, by priests and priestesses who were themselves in a state of ritual purity. The patterns on these garments were not for aesthetic pleasure, they were functional theology. A robe for a statue of Osiris might have been woven with a complex, repeating pattern of crooks and flails, the symbols of his kingship, and tiny, shimmering Ankh symbols, each one a battery of life force for the god. The linen itself, blessed by Teot, combined with the sacred patterns, transformed the cloth into a skin of power for the deity, a necessary component for the god to manifest their presence and interact with the human realm. These most holy of textiles, used until they were threadbare and then reverently stored or buried, are the most completely lost of all. Their patterns known only to the gods they served and the priests who tended them, a final, profound layer of mystery in our search for the patterns woven into eternity. This brings us to the cutting edge of our search, where the silent evidence of the past is finally beginning to speak, not because we've found new artifacts, but because we have developed new eyes. The field of digital archaeology is revolutionizing our understanding, turning seemingly blank pieces of ancient linen into readable documents. At the forefront of this technological renaissance are techniques like multispectral imaging, a process that allows us to see the invisible. The human eye perceives only a narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum, which we call visible light, but light is made of many wavelengths, from infrared to ultraviolet. Multispectral imaging uses specialized cameras to capture how an object reflects or emits light across these different wavelengths, far beyond what we can naturally see. A piece of mummy wrapping that appears to be a uniform, faded beige to our naked eyes, might reveal a completely different story under infrared or ultraviolet light. The mineral residues from ancient dyes, now completely invisible, can absorb or reflect these non-visible wavelengths in unique ways, creating a stark contrast against the linen background. It's like using a supernatural filter. Suddenly, the ghost of a pattern, a faded red stripe, a yellow ochre symbol can leap out from the cloth, clear and defined, a message from the past that has been waiting millennia to be decoded. The application of this technology is yielding breathtaking results. Researchers are now systematically scanning the vast collections of linen fragments held in museum storerooms around the world, collections that have been studied for a century, but never with this kind of vision. One of the most promising targets is cartonnage, the plastered and painted mummy cases made from layers of linen and papyrus. For years, Egyptologists assumed the linen inside was just scrap, a structural filler. But by applying multispectral imaging to the edges and broken sections of these cases, scientists are discovering that the linen within often bears the faint, painted traces of earlier patterns. It appears the Egyptians, ever practical, would sometimes recycle old textiles, perhaps even ceremonial banners or worn-out clothing, by embedding them into the cartonnage. The outer surface received a new painting, but the original, hidden pattern on the cloth was preserved in the dark, stable environment. Now, by peering into the layers with these advanced scanners, we can recover these lost designs, seeing the vibrant art that was considered outdated or used up, giving us a direct look at fashions and symbols that were literally covered up and forgotten. Beyond just seeing the patterns, this technology helps us understand the very process of creation. High-resolution 3D scanning and reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, are allowing us to examine textile surfaces at a microscopic level. RTI involves taking dozens of photographs of an object, each with light projected from a different angle. A computer then combines these images to create an interactive digital file where you can virtually move the light source across the surface. This is revolutionary for studying texture. On a piece of linen that seems perfectly smooth, RTI can reveal the subtle, raised ridges of a painted design, the slight impression left by a stamped seal, or even the minute variations in the weave that indicate a complex pattern was once present. It can distinguish between a dye that soaked into the fibers and a pigment that was painted on top, telling us not just what the pattern was, but how it was made. This level of detail helps settle long-standing debates. Was a particular design shown in a tomb painting a woven tapestry or a painted decoration? By analyzing the texture of a rare surviving fragment with RTI, we can look for the telltale signs of woven threads versus brush strokes, moving from speculation toward certainty. Perhaps the most profound impact of this digital toolkit is its non-destructive nature. For centuries, the only way to analyze an artifact was to take a physical sample, a process that inevitably damages the object, no matter how small the fragment. With techniques like multispectral imaging and 3D scanning, the artifact remains completely untouched. Researchers can gather terabytes of data without a single fiber being disturbed. This is not just about preservation, it's about access. A priceless mummy bundle in a museum in Cairo can be scanned in exquisite detail, and that digital model can then be studied simultaneously by a team of experts in London, Berlin, and New York. They can virtually unwrap the mummy layer by layer, examining the textile patterns on each level without ever risking the physical degradation that would come from actual unwrapping. This collaborative, global approach is accelerating the pace of discovery, turning every museum collection into a potential gold mine of new information, simply by looking at their existing holdings in a new light. The ultimate goal of all this digital detective work is reconstruction. Once a faint pattern is detected and mapped using these imaging techniques, the data doesn't just sit in a database. It becomes the blueprint for a physical revival. Artists and textile specialists are now using these digital maps to guide the recreation of ancient Egyptian patterns with astonishing accuracy. They can match the precise shade of red detected by chemical analysis, spin linen thread to the same thickness revealed under high-resolution scans, and replicate a weaving pattern down to the last thread count. The result is a tangible, physical fabric that we can see and touch, a vibrant echo of a design that hasn't been visible for over 3,000 years. This process closes the loop between the abstract world of data and the physical reality of history. It transforms a faint, digital shadow on a screen into a swatch of cloth that shimmers with color, allowing us to finally experience a fraction of the visual splendor that defined the ancient Egyptian world, a world we are only now, with the help of 21st century technology, truly beginning to see. So, where does this grand detective story leave us? After this journey through chemical ghosts and painted echoes, through the silent testimony of looms and the shimmer of faience beads, we are left not with a single, definitive picture, but with something far richer, a layered, vibrant tapestry of probability, a portrait of an ancient world that was profoundly, beautifully chromatic. The truth of Egyptian textiles is not found in the stark, beige fragments alone, but in the convergence of all our clues. The tomb paintings are not artistic license, they are a catalog. The faded dyes detected by mass spectrometry are not mere chemical formulas, they are the whispers of a royal crimson, a celestial blue. The intricate bead net dresses are not curious anomalies, they are the eternal, mineralized echoes of fashions that shimmered and rustled with life. And the modern recreations, born from experimental archaeology and digital imaging, are not just replicas. They are arguments made tangible, hypotheses woven into thread, proving that what the ancients depicted, they could, and surely did, create. When we pull all these threads together, a final, breathtaking image emerges. It is an image that shatters the monochrome illusion of a desert civilization. Imagine the main thoroughfare of Thebes during the Opet festival. The air is thick with incense and the sound of sistrums. The procession passes, and it is a moving gallery of textile art. You do not see a sea of white. You see the sun glinting off the razor-sharp pleats of a priest's robe, a garment so fine it is nearly transparent. You see a noblewoman's shawl, its border a repeating, tapestry-woven pattern of ankhs and jed pillars in deep madder red and brilliant indigo. You catch a glimpse of a soldier's heavy woolen cloak, a practical garment brought from a northern campaign, woven with bold, foreign stripes of saffron yellow. And at the heart of it all, the god's statue, carried on a golden bark, is draped in a sacred vestment so exclusive its pattern is a state secret, perhaps woven with gold thread to form the outstretched wings of the vulture goddess herself. This was the real ancient Egypt, a society that expressed its identity, its faith, and its power not just in stone and gold, but in the very cloth that moved with its people. This understanding forces a profound reflection on the nature of beauty and history. We are conditioned to think of the ancient past through the objects that have endured, the granite, the gold, the fired clay. These are the voices that shout across the centuries, but the story of Egyptian textiles is a story of the quiet voices, the ones that spoke in the language of delicate threads and fugitive colors. Their silence in the archaeological record is not a sign of their unimportance, but a testament to their humanity. The most personal, intimate, and daily expressions of beauty, the feel of a fine linen dress, the protective symbol embroidered on a child's tunic, the colorful sash worn for a festival were, by their very nature, the most ephemeral. They were meant for the moment, for the living, breathing experience of life. Their loss is a poignant reminder that history is not just what survives, but also all that was loved, used, and worn away. The relentless Egyptian sun that bleached their colors is the same force that gives their stone monuments such stark power, creating a cruel, beautiful irony. We remember their eternal, rigid death, but we have lost the vibrant, flowing evidence of their lives. And this, perhaps, is the source of Egypt's endless fascination. For every answer we uncover, a dozen new mysteries unfurl. We have proven they had the dyes, the looms, and the artistic vision to create masterpieces of textile art. We can now, with some confidence, envision the world in color. But the specific patterns on Akhenaten's revolutionary robes, the exact hieroglyph stitched into a priest's hem, the unique combination of spirals and lotus buds on a queen's festival gown, these intimate details are likely gone forever. They are the ghosts in the fabric, the negative space that defines our knowledge. This is not a failure of archaeology, but its deepest allure. The lost textile patterns of ancient Egypt are a permanent invitation to wonder, a puzzle that can never be fully solved, ensuring that this civilization, even in its most fleeting and personal arts, will never cease to captivate us. The search for these vanished patterns is more than a technical pursuit. It is a quest to understand the human heart of a people who, thousands of years ago, sought to weave their dreams, their prayers, and their very souls into the cloth they wore.